There are places in the Cascades where sound doesn't travel the way it should. Monte Cristo sits at the end of a dead-end road, 23 miles into the Snohomish County wilderness. What remains is barely a town. Foundations mostly, a few skeletal cabins leaning into the mountainside, and the stone shell of what used to be the Monte Cristo Methodist Church. The mine closed in 1907. The railroad pulled out 2 years later. By 1920, the forest had reclaimed most of what was left. No one lives there now, but people still go. And some of them hear things they can't explain. The town was built in 1889 when prospectors found silver and gold in the peaks above the Sauk River. For a decade, Monte Cristo boomed. At its height, nearly 2,000 people lived in the valley, miners, merchants, families. The church was finished in 1898, built with timber hauled from lower elevations and fitted with a pipe organ shipped by rail from Seattle. Sunday services were well attended. The building stood at the center of town, just west of the assay office, its steeple visible from the surrounding claims. On the morning of March 14, 1907, a lantern overturned in the church kitchen. The fire spread quickly. By the time the volunteers arrived with buckets, the roof had collapsed. No one was inside. The pastor, Reverend William Hargrove, had left for Everett 2 days earlier to visit his sister. The organ was destroyed. The walls, made of local stone, remained standing. They still do. After the fire, attendance declined. The mines were already failing, yields thinning out, and by 1910, most families had moved on. Monte Cristo became a ghost town in everything but name. The Forest Service claimed the area in 1938. The ruins were left alone, considered too remote and too damaged to warrant removal. For decades, Monte Cristo was a footnote in regional mining histories, a failed venture, nothing more. Then, in late November of 1983, something changed. A group of 6 hikers from Seattle made the trek into Monte Cristo during an early winter storm. They had planned to camp near the old town site and return the following day. According to the trip report filed with the Darrington Ranger Station, the group arrived around 3 in the afternoon. Snow was falling steadily. Visibility was poor. They set up camp near the river, a quarter mile from the church ruins. Around 5:30, as darkness settled in, one of the hikers, a man named Robert Callahan, walked toward the church to take photographs. The others stayed at camp preparing dinner. Callahan returned 20 minutes later, visibly shaken. He told the group he had heard singing. In his written account, provided to the ranger station the following week, Callahan described the sound as choral, 4 distinct voices, harmonizing in a way that suggested training. He estimated the voices were coming from inside the church ruins, though he couldn't see anyone. He approached to within 30 feet, then stopped. The singing continued for approximately 3 minutes, then ceased abruptly. Callahan said the melody was unfamiliar, and the language, if it was language, wasn't English. He didn't recognize it as Spanish, French, or German, the only other languages he knew. The rest of the group dismissed it as wind, or perhaps an acoustic trick caused by the storm. But the next morning, 2 others reported hearing the same thing. This time it was just after dawn, during another period of heavy snowfall. The voices lasted longer, closer to 5 minutes. One of the hikers, a woman named Margaret Poole, recorded a portion of it on a cassette tape. The recording still exists. The tape was analyzed in 1984 by a linguist at the University of Washington, Dr. Evan Travers. His report, later summarized in a small regional journal, noted that the voices were human, that they followed recognizable Western harmonic structure, and that the phonemes did not correspond to any language in his database. He described the recording as liturgical in character, but could not identify the tradition. Dr. Travers also noted an unusual quality to the recording, a kind of reverberation that didn't match the known acoustics of open-air ruins. Other hikers began reporting similar experiences. Not all of them, and not consistently, but enough that the Darrington Ranger Station began keeping informal records. Between 1984 and 2003, 17 separate groups filed reports describing choral singing near the Monte Cristo church ruins. In every case, the singing occurred during snowfall. In every case, it lasted between 3 and 7 minutes. In every case, no source was visible. A forest ranger named Thomas Lindquist visited the site in February of 1991, specifically to investigate the reports. He brought audio equipment and spent 2 nights camped near the ruins during a winter storm. On the second night, he heard it. His recording captured 4 voices: soprano, alto, tenor, bass, singing in close harmony. The melody repeated twice, then stopped. Lindquist described the experience in his field notes as unnerving, not because of what I heard, but because I couldn't locate it. He walked the perimeter of the ruins during the singing. The sound did not grow louder or quieter as he moved. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. When he stood inside the church walls, the singing continued, but with no discernible direction. After it stopped, Lindquist waited for 2 hours in silence. It did not resume. He left the following morning and declined to return. Lindquist's report was filed with the Forest Service but never made public. A request for the document, submitted under the Freedom of Information Act in 2009, was denied on the grounds that it contained employee observations not relevant to public safety. The recording he made was not included in the file. Attempts to document the phenomenon have been inconsistent. Some hikers bring recording equipment and hear nothing. Others arrive without any intention of investigating and hear the singing clearly. There is no pattern to the sightings beyond the presence of snow. Temperature, time of day, and moon phase appear irrelevant. The singing has been reported in December, January, February, and March, never outside those months. In 2006, a team of acoustic researchers from Oregon State University received permission to conduct a study at Monte Cristo. They installed microphones at multiple points around the ruins and monitored them remotely for 6 weeks during the winter season. The equipment recorded ambient wind, water from the nearby river, and occasional animal calls. No singing. The researchers concluded that previous reports were likely auditory pareidolia, the brain's tendency to impose familiar patterns onto random noise. But the lead researcher, Dr. Sandra Oakes, added a note to her final report. During the team's one on-site visit in late February, while snow was falling, she heard something she could not explain. She described it as brief, distant, and choral. But her equipment captured nothing. She wrote that the experience did not align with the data and recommended further study. No follow-up was funded. Local hikers still talk about the church. Some avoid it entirely. Others go specifically to hear the singing, though most leave disappointed. A man named Kyle Whitmore, who has hiked to Monte Cristo more than 30 times since 2010, says he's heard it twice, once in 2012, once in 2018, both times during heavy snow, both times alone. "It's not frightening," he said in an interview for a hiking blog in 2019. "It's just wrong, like it's not supposed to be there. You know how some sounds feel out of place? It's that, but worse. Because it's beautiful, and that makes it worse." The ruins remain open to the public. The Forest Service has placed no restrictions on access. The trail is poorly maintained, often impassable in winter. But a few dozen people make the trip each year. Most take photographs and leave. A handful stay to listen. Some hear nothing. Some hear exactly what they came for. In 2022, a new recording surfaced on a backcountry forum. A hiker who requested anonymity posted audio captured in January of that year. The file is 11 minutes long. For the first 9 minutes, there is only wind and the crunch of footsteps in snow. Then faintly, voices, 4 of them, harmonizing. The hiker does not speak. The singing lasts 4 minutes and 30 seconds, then stops. The recording ends shortly after. No translation has been offered, no language identified, no explanation given. The church burned in 1907. No one died. The singing started 76 years later. It continues still, but only when the snow falls, and only for those who happen to be listening. Some buildings refuse to stay empty. Leicester is barely a town anymore, more of a wide spot along State Route 410 where the Green River cuts through the Cascade foothills. There are no services, no gas stations, no stores, just a handful of weathered houses, a volunteer fire station, and the skeletal remains of what used to be the Northern Pacific Railway depot. The railroad built Leicester in 1908 as a helper station, where additional locomotives were attached to freight trains climbing Stampede Pass. For 75 years, the depot operated around the clock. Engineers and brakemen waited there between shifts. Families lived in company housing nearby. Then, in May of 1983, the Northern Pacific rerouted its main line, and Leicester lost its purpose overnight. The depot closed on the 16th of that month. The last scheduled train passed through at 11:47 p.m. According to company records, the station agent on duty, a man named Gerald Pruitt, locked the doors at midnight and turned off the lights. He retired 3 weeks later. The building was left standing, too remote and too deteriorated to justify demolition. The tracks remain, still used occasionally for freight, but the depot has been dark for more than 40 years, except when it isn't. The first documented sighting came in October of 1986. A truck driver named Raymond Vasquez was hauling timber down from Snoqualmie Pass when his rig developed transmission trouble near Leicester. He pulled over just past the depot around 11:30 p.m. and called for a tow on his CB radio. While waiting, he noticed a light in one of the depot windows, the far left window of the waiting room facing the road. Vasquez described the light as steady and yellowish, like an incandescent bulb. He assumed someone was squatting in the building, possibly using a generator. He walked over to ask if they had tools. The light was still visible as he approached. But when he reached the front door and looked through the glass, the interior was completely dark. He tried the door, locked. He walked around to the window he'd seen lit from the road. Dark. He returned to his truck and waited for the tow. The light did not reappear. Vasquez mentioned the incident to the tow truck driver, a local man named Frank Delgado, who said he'd heard similar stories. Delgado told Vasquez that people had been seeing lights in the depot since it closed, always the same window, always late at night. Delgado himself had never seen it, but his brother-in-law claimed he had, twice, both times around midnight. Vasquez filed the experience as strange, but didn't pursue it further. Over the next decade, reports accumulated slowly. Most came from travelers passing through late at night, truck drivers, motorcyclists, the occasional lost tourist. The pattern was consistent: a single lit window, visible from the road, extinguished upon approach. No one reported seeing movement inside. No one ever found the building unlocked. But in 1994, a hiker named Joanna Rift decided to investigate more thoroughly. Drift had read about the Leicester Depot in a paranormal newsletter and drove out from Seattle on a Friday night in November. She arrived at 11:20 p.m. and parked across from the building. She brought a flashlight, a camera, and a notebook. At 11:47 p.m., according to her written account, the light appeared in the waiting room window, exactly as described. She photographed it, then approached on foot. The light remained visible as she crossed the road. She could see it clearly through the window, illuminating a portion of the interior. But as soon as she stepped onto the depot platform, it went out. She waited for 10 minutes. Nothing. She returned to her car and watched. At 11:53 p.m., the light reappeared. This time, she ran. Same result. It vanished the moment she reached the platform. Frustrated, Drift tried a different approach. She used her flashlight to examine the building's exterior, looking for a power source or evidence of trespassing. She found nothing. The windows were intact but filthy. The doors were locked and showed no signs of forced entry. Then she noticed something else. The front door had a narrow gap at the bottom, and her flashlight beam revealed a layer of undisturbed dust on the floor inside. Drift knelt and shone the light across the waiting room. She could make out the outlines of old benches, a ticket counter, and a door leading to what was likely the station agent's office. And there, in the dust, she saw footprints. They weren't fresh, but they weren't decades old either. They formed a clear path, 10 feet long, running from the bench nearest the lit window to the wall opposite, then back, over and over. The same line, worn smooth in places where the dust had been completely displaced. Drift estimated the path had been walked hundreds of times, possibly more. She took photographs through the door gap, though the angle was poor and the images came out grainy. Drift returned 3 more times over the next 2 years. Twice she saw the light. Once she brought a friend, a photographer named Michael Pruitt, no relation to the former station agent, who confirmed the sighting and documented it on video. The footage, uploaded to a paranormal research website in 1997, shows a steady yellow glow in the window for approximately 4 minutes before it abruptly disappears. The timestamp on the video reads 11:47 p.m. By 2000, the Leicester Depot had gained a small following among paranormal enthusiasts. Visitors began leaving notes in a guest book kept in a plastic bin near the front door. Entries describe similar experiences, the light appearing at 11:47 p.m., vanishing upon approach, and the unsettling sense that something inside is waiting. Several visitors noted the footprints in the dust, visible through the door gap, and remarked that the pattern seemed to have deepened over time. In 2004, the King County Sheriff's Office received a complaint from a property owner in Leicester who was concerned about trespassers. A deputy, Officer Laura Dietrich, was dispatched to assess the situation. Her report, filed on December 9th, describes the depot as structurally unsound and hazardous, but makes no mention of the light. However, in a follow-up interview conducted for a local history project in 2011, Dietrich acknowledged that she'd visited the depot at night, out of curiosity, and had seen the light herself. "It was there," she said. "I'm not going to argue about it. I saw it, same as everyone else. 11:47, just like they said. I walked up to check it out, and it went dark. I don't know what it was, reflection maybe, but I've been a cop for 15 years, and I've never seen a reflection do that." Dietrich also mentioned the footprints. She said she'd requested permission to enter the building to investigate, but the railroad company, which still technically owned the property, denied access. No explanation was provided. Attempts to study the phenomenon scientifically have been limited. In 2008, a team of electrical engineers from the University of Washington drove to Leicester with the intention of measuring electromagnetic fields and documenting the light with calibrated equipment. They arrived at 10 p.m. and set up sensors around the depot. At 11:47 p.m., their instruments detected a brief spike in electromagnetic activity, but no light appeared. The team waited until 1 a.m., then left. Their findings were inconclusive. A second attempt, in 2013, yielded different results. This time, researchers from a private paranormal investigation group spent 2 consecutive nights at the depot. On the first night, nothing happened. On the second night, the light appeared at 11:47 p.m., exactly as reported. One researcher approached the building with a thermal camera. The device registered no heat signature from the window despite the visible illumination. The light extinguished when he reached the platform. The team returned to review their footage and found something unexpected. Audio recorded inside the waiting room via a microphone they'd placed near the door gap captured the faint sound of footsteps, slow, rhythmic, pacing. The railroad company declined requests for further access. In 2016, the depot was officially declared a hazard, and the county posted no trespassing signs. Visitors continued to arrive anyway, the guest book filled with entries. Some people saw the light, others didn't. But everyone who looked through the door gap noted the footprints, still there, still following the same 10-foot path. In 2020, a journalist named Aaron Bledsoe wrote an article for a regional magazine about the Lester Depot. He interviewed more than 20 people who claimed to have seen the light, including Vasquez, Drift, and Dietrich. He also obtained a copy of the Northern Pacific's closure records for the depot. According to the documents, the last train to stop at Lester arrived at 11:47 p.m. on May 16, 1983. It departed 12 minutes later. The station agent on duty, Gerald Pruitt, was alone. Bledsoe attempted to contact Pruitt for the article, but discovered that he had died in 1998. Pruitt's daughter, Susan Kovac, agreed to an interview. She said her father had worked for the railroad for 32 years and had never mentioned anything unusual about the depot. She did, however, recall that he'd been deeply unsettled by the closure. He didn't want to leave, Kovac said. He kept saying the trains would come back. He'd worked that station his whole career. It was hard for him. Kovac also mentioned that her father had visited Lester once after his retirement in 1985. He told her he'd driven out late at night to see the depot one last time. When she asked why he'd gone so late, he said he wanted to be there at 11:47, the time the last train had arrived. Kovac didn't ask why that mattered. She said her father never spoke about Lester again. The depot still stands. The light still appears, though not every night, and not for everyone. The footprints remain visible through the door gap, worn deeper now, as if whoever walks that line has been doing so for decades. Some nights, travelers passing through Lester slow down near the depot, watching for the glow in the waiting room window. Most see nothing. But at 11:47 p.m., when the conditions are right, the light returns. And when it does, it looks exactly like someone left it on, expecting a train that will never arrive. There are forests that grow without birds. Molson sits 3 miles south of the Canadian border in Okanogan County, Washington, a ghost town that died twice. The first settlement, called Old Molson, was established in 1890 when prospectors found gold in the hills near Chesaw. By 1896, the town had a population of 300, with a school, a newspaper, and 2 competing general stores. But the gold ran out quickly, and by 1900, most residents had left. A second attempt at settlement began in 1905, half a mile west of the original site. This version, called New Molson, lasted longer but fared no better. By 1935, it too was abandoned. What remains today is a collection of weathered buildings, rusted equipment, and a grove of ponderosa pines that grows where nothing else will. The grove stands at the eastern edge of Old Molson, on a slight rise overlooking the valley. It covers roughly 2 acres and contains exactly 144 trees arranged in 12 rows of 12. The spacing is precise, each tree planted exactly 15 feet from its neighbors. The trunks are uniform in diameter, and the canopy forms an almost perfect plane. No undergrowth grows beneath them. No birds nest in their branches. The ground is bare except for a thin layer of needles that never seems to accumulate or decay. Local history suggests the grove was planted in 1912 by a land speculator named John Aldrich, who bought the old Molson site after the first settlement failed. According to a brief mention in the Okanogan Independent from August of that year, Aldrich intended to develop the property for agriculture and planted the pines as a windbreak. But Aldrich left the area in 1914, and the trees were never harvested or maintained. They simply grew in perfect rows for more than a century. The first documented anomaly came in May of 1973. A forestry student from Washington State University named David Khalil was conducting a survey of regional pine stands as part of his thesis research. He visited Molson to document growth patterns in abandoned areas. When he examined the grove, he noticed something unusual. The trees appeared to be genetically identical. He took core samples from 6 trees at random points across the grove. Laboratory analysis confirmed his suspicion. All 6 samples showed identical genetic markers, suggesting they were clones. Khalil found this strange but not impossible. Ponderosa pines can reproduce through root sprouting, though it's uncommon. What troubled him more was the age of the trees. Ring counts suggested they had all been planted in the same year, 1912, consistent with the newspaper account, but the growth rings were abnormally regular. Most trees show variation in ring width depending on annual rainfall and temperature. These trees showed almost none. Each ring was nearly identical in thickness, as if the grove had experienced the same conditions every year for 6 decades. Khalil returned to Molson in June to collect additional samples. This time, he brought a colleague, another graduate student named Rita Osman. They spent 2 days mapping the grove and taking soil samples. Osman noted that the soil beneath the trees was unusually compacted and low in organic material, which didn't align with 60 years of needle fall. She also observed that the grove was completely silent. No insects, no birds, no small mammals. When she mentioned this to a local rancher who owned adjacent property, he told her the trees had always been that way. "Nothing goes in there," the rancher, whose name was listed in Khalil's notes as Howard Bright, told them. "Cattle won't graze near it. Deer won't bed down. Even the coyotes avoid it. My father said the same thing when he ran this place. Those trees aren't right." Khalil asked Bright if he knew why the grove had been planted. Bright said he didn't, but he mentioned something his father had told him, that the trees were planted over the old cemetery. Khalil checked the county records when he returned to Pullman. There was no documentation of a cemetery in Molson, old or new. He contacted the Okanogan County Historical Society. They had no record of burial plots in the area. Khalil's thesis, completed in 1974, included a section on the Molson Grove, but offered no conclusions. He noted the genetic uniformity, the unusual growth patterns, and the absence of wildlife, but he could not explain any of it. In 1989, a team of arborists from the University of British Columbia visited Molson as part of a cross-border study on old-growth forests. They were not initially interested in the grove. It was too young and too clearly cultivated, but they examined it briefly for comparison. One of the researchers, Dr. Evelyn Strand, brought ground-penetrating radar equipment to assess root structure. The results were unexpected. The root systems of the trees formed patterns. When mapped from above, they created shapes, geometric designs that repeated across the grove. Strand described them as deliberate in her field notes, though she offered no theory as to how or why. The patterns resembled symbols, though Strand could not identify them. She took photographs of the radar images and submitted them to colleagues in archaeology and anthropology. No one recognized the shapes. Strand also noted something else. The roots extended far deeper than typical for ponderosa pines in that soil type. Most of the roots reached depths of 12 to 15 feet, well beyond what would be necessary for water access. In several locations, the radar detected voids beneath the roots, empty spaces in the soil, roughly the size and shape of wooden boxes. Strand contacted Okanogan County to request permission to excavate. Her request was forwarded to the State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, which conducted a preliminary review. In a letter dated March 19, 1990, the department denied the request, stating that the site did not meet criteria for historical significance and that excavation would disrupt private property without sufficient justification. Strand appealed the decision but was denied again. She published her findings in a forestry journal in 1991, including the radar images, but the article received little attention. A local historian named Margaret Tolliver read Strand's paper and began researching the Molson Cemetery question. Tolliver had lived in Okanogan County her entire life and had heard stories about Old Molson from her grandparents, who had passed through the area in the 1920s. According to family accounts, there had been a cemetery, small, poorly maintained, and located on the eastern edge of town. Tolliver searched newspaper archives and land records, but found no official documentation. She did, however, find a reference in a personal letter held by the Okanogan County Historical Society. The letter, dated November 1911, was written by a woman named Clara Jensen to her sister in Spokane. Jensen described the cemetery as overgrown and neglected, with perhaps 24 graves, most unmarked. She mentioned that the town council had discussed relocating the graves when the land was sold, but there was no indication that relocation ever occurred. Tolliver found no further correspondence from Jensen and no records of grave removal. Tolliver visited the grove in October of 1992. She walked the rows, noting the spacing and the silence. She also observed something that had not been mentioned in previous reports. The trees all leaned slightly inward toward the center of the grove, as if drawn by something beneath the ground. The deviation was subtle, no more than 2 or 3 degrees, but it was consistent across all 144 trees. Tolliver spoke with several longtime residents of the Okanogan Valley. Most had heard stories about the grove, but had never visited it. One woman, whose family had owned a ranch near Molson in the 1940s, said her grandfather refused to cut firewood from the grove even during harsh winters. When asked why, he would only say, "Those trees are spoken for." In 2003, a photographer named Alex Moreno visited Molson to document ghost towns of the Pacific Northwest. He spent an afternoon in the grove, taking long exposure shots of the trees at dusk. When he reviewed the images later, he noticed something unusual. The shadows cast by the trees did not align with the position of the sun. The shadows fell inward toward the center of the grove, regardless of the time of day. Moreno returned the following week to verify. The effect persisted. Moreno posted the photographs online, and they attracted attention from several paranormal research groups. One group, based in Seattle, visited the grove in 2004 and conducted electromagnetic field measurements. They detected anomalies, localized distortions in the magnetic field, at several points within the grove, particularly near the center. The distortions did not correspond to any known geological features. The group returned twice more, but could not determine the source. Attempts to access historical land surveys for the Molson area have been complicated by incomplete records. A fire at the Okanogan County Courthouse in 1928 destroyed many documents from the late 1800s and early 1900s. What remains suggests that the land where the grove now stands was transferred multiple times between 1900 and 1912. But the purpose of the transfers is unclear. John Aldrich's name appears on a deed dated April 1912, but there is no record of what he paid for the land or what he intended to do with it beyond the single newspaper mention of windbreak planting. In 2018, a soil scientist named Dr. Yuki Tanaka obtained permission to conduct non-invasive testing in the grove. Using a portable X-ray fluorescence analyzer, She measured trace elements in the soil. She found elevated levels of calcium and phosphorus, consistent with the decomposition of organic material, concentrated in a grid pattern that matched the spacing of the trees. Tanaka's findings suggested that something had been buried beneath the grove, but she could not determine what. Her request to conduct further analysis was denied by the property owner, who had grown weary of researchers. The grove remains. The trees still stand in perfect rows, leaning inward, silent and still. No birds, no insects, no undergrowth. Visitors report a sense of unease, though they struggle to articulate why. Some describe it as a weight, pressing down from above. Others say it feels like the ground is listening. The symbols in the roots have never been identified. The voids beneath them have never been excavated, and the cemetery, if it ever existed, has never been found. But the trees remember something, and whatever it is, it has been growing there for more than a century. There are forests that grow without birds. Molson sits 3 miles south of the Canadian border in Okanogan County, Washington, a ghost town that died twice. The first settlement, called Old Molson, was established in 1890 when prospectors found gold in the hills near Chesaw. By 1896, the town had a population of 300, with a school, a newspaper, and 2 competing general stores. But the gold ran out quickly, and by 1900, most residents had left. A second attempt at settlement began in 1905, half a mile west of the original site. This version, called New Molson, lasted longer but fared no better. By 1935, it too was abandoned. What remains today is a collection of weathered buildings, rusted equipment, and a grove of ponderosa pines that grows where nothing else will. The grove stands at the eastern edge of Old Molson, on a slight rise overlooking the valley. It covers roughly 2 acres and contains exactly 144 trees arranged in 12 rows of 12. The spacing is precise, each tree planted exactly 15 feet from its neighbors. The trunks are uniform in diameter, and the canopy forms an almost perfect plane. No undergrowth grows beneath them. No birds nest in their branches. The ground is bare except for a thin layer of needles that never seems to accumulate or decay. Local history suggests the grove was planted in 1912 by a land speculator named John Aldrich, who bought the Old Molson site after the first settlement failed. According to a brief mention in the Okanogan Independent from August of that year, Aldrich intended to develop the property for agriculture and planted the pines as a windbreak. But Aldrich left the area in 1914, and the trees were never harvested or maintained. They simply grew in perfect rows for more than a century. The first documented anomaly came in May of 1973. A forestry student from Washington State University named David Khalil was conducting a survey of regional pine stands as part of his thesis research. He visited Molson to document growth patterns in abandoned areas. When he examined the grove, he noticed something unusual. The trees appeared to be genetically identical. He took core samples from 6 trees at random points across the grove. Laboratory analysis confirmed his suspicion. All 6 samples showed identical genetic markers, suggesting they were clones. Khalil found this strange but not impossible. Ponderosa pines can reproduce through root sprouting, though it's uncommon. What troubled him more was the age of the trees. Ring counts suggested they had all been planted in the same year, 1912, consistent with the newspaper account, but the growth rings were abnormally regular. Most trees show variation in ring width depending on annual rainfall and temperature. These trees showed almost none. Each ring was nearly identical in thickness, as if the grove had experienced the same conditions every year for 6 decades. Khalil returned to Molson in June to collect additional samples. This time, he brought a colleague, another graduate student named Rita Osman. They spent 2 days mapping the grove and taking soil samples. Osmond noted that the soil beneath the trees was unusually compacted and low in organic material, which didn't align with 60 years of needle fall. She also observed that the grove was completely silent. No insects, no birds, no small mammals. When she mentioned this to a local rancher who owned adjacent property, he told her the trees had always been that way. "Nothing goes in there," the rancher, whose name was listed in Khalil's notes as Howard Bright, told them. "Cattle won't graze near it. Deer won't bed down. Even the coyotes avoid it. My father said the same thing when he ran this place. Those trees aren't right." Khalil asked Bright if he knew why the grove had been planted. Bright said he didn't, but he mentioned something his father had told him, that the trees were planted over the old cemetery. Khalil checked the county records when he returned to Pullman. There was no documentation of a cemetery in Molson, old or new. He contacted the Okanogan County Historical Society. They had no record of burial plots in the area. Khalil's thesis, completed in 1974, included a section on the Molson Grove, but offered no conclusions. He noted the genetic uniformity, the unusual growth patterns, and the absence of wildlife, but he could not explain any of it. In 1989, a team of arborists from the University of British Columbia visited Molson as part of a cross-border study on old-growth forests. They were not initially interested in the grove. It was too young and too clearly cultivated, but they examined it briefly for comparison. One of the researchers, Dr. Evelyn Strand, brought ground-penetrating radar equipment to assess root structure. The results were unexpected. The root systems of the trees formed patterns. When mapped from above, they created shapes, geometric designs that repeated across the grove. Strand described them as deliberate in her field notes, though she offered no theory as to how or why. The patterns resembled symbols, though Strand could not identify them. She took photographs of the radar images and submitted them to colleagues in archaeology and anthropology. No one recognized the shapes. Strand also noted something else. The roots extended far deeper than typical for ponderosa pines in that soil type. Most of the roots reached depths of 12 to 15 feet, well beyond what would be necessary for water access. In several locations, the radar detected voids beneath the roots, empty spaces in the soil, roughly the size and shape of wooden boxes. Strand contacted Okanogan County to request permission to excavate. Her request was forwarded to the State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, which conducted a preliminary review. In a letter dated March 19, 1990, the department denied the request, stating that the site did not meet criteria for historical significance and that excavation would disrupt private property without sufficient justification. Strand appealed the decision but was denied again. She published her findings in a forestry journal in 1991, including the radar images, but the article received little attention. A local historian named Margaret Tolliver read Strand's paper and began researching the Molson Cemetery question. Tolliver had lived in Okanogan County her entire life and had heard stories about Old Molson from her grandparents, who had passed through the area in the 1920s. According to family accounts, there had been a cemetery, small, poorly maintained, and located on the eastern edge of town. Tolliver searched newspaper archives and land records, but found no official documentation. She did, however, find a reference in a personal letter held by the Okanogan County Historical Society. The letter, dated November 1911, was written by a woman named Clara Jensen to her sister in Spokane. Jensen described the cemetery as overgrown and neglected, with perhaps 24 graves, most unmarked. She mentioned that the town council had discussed relocating the graves when the land was sold, but there was no indication that relocation ever occurred. Tolliver found no further correspondence from Jensen and no records of grave removal. Tolliver visited the grove in October of 1992. She walked the rows, noting the spacing and the silence. She also observed something that had not been mentioned in previous reports. The trees all leaned slightly inward toward the center of the grove, as if drawn by something beneath the ground. The deviation was subtle, no more than 2 or 3 degrees, but it was consistent across all 144 trees. Tolliver spoke with several longtime residents of the Okanogan Valley. Most had heard stories about the grove, but had never visited it. One woman, whose family had owned a ranch near Molson in the 1940s, said her grandfather refused to cut firewood from the grove even during harsh winters. When asked why, he would only say, "Those trees are spoken for." In 2003, a photographer named Alex Moreno visited Molson to document ghost towns of the Pacific Northwest. He spent an afternoon in the grove, taking long exposure shots of the trees at dusk. When he reviewed the images later, he noticed something unusual. The shadows cast by the trees did not align with the position of the sun. The shadows fell inward toward the center of the grove, regardless of the time of day. Moreno returned the following week to verify. The effect persisted. Moreno posted the photographs online, and they attracted attention from several paranormal research groups. One group, based in Seattle, visited the grove in 2004 and conducted electromagnetic field measurements. They detected anomalies, localized distortions in the magnetic field, at several points within the grove, particularly near the center. The distortions did not correspond to any known geological features. The group returned twice more, but could not determine the source. Attempts to access historical land surveys for the Molson area have been complicated by incomplete records. A fire at the Okanogan County Courthouse in 1928 destroyed many documents from the late 1800s and early 1900s. What remains suggests that the land where the grove now stands was transferred multiple times between 1900 and 1912. But the purpose of the transfers is unclear. John Aldrich's name appears on a deed dated April 1912, but there is no record of what he paid for the land or what he intended to do with it beyond the single newspaper mention of windbreak planting. In 2018, a soil scientist named Dr. Yuki Tanaka obtained permission to conduct non-invasive testing in the grove. Using a portable X-ray fluorescence analyzer, she measured trace elements in the soil. She found elevated levels of calcium and phosphorus, consistent with the decomposition of organic material, concentrated in a grid pattern that matched the spacing of the trees. Tanaka's findings suggested that something had been buried beneath the grove, but she could not determine what. Her request to conduct further analysis was denied by the property owner, who had grown weary of researchers. The grove remains. The trees still stand in perfect rows, leaning inward, silent and still. No birds, no insects, no undergrowth. Visitors report a sense of unease, though they struggle to articulate why. Some describe it as a weight, pressing down from above. Others say it feels like the ground is listening. The symbols in the roots have never been identified. The voids beneath them have never been excavated, and the cemetery, if it ever existed, has never been found. But the trees remember something, and whatever it is, it has been growing there for more than a century. Some structures outlast the towns they served. Govan was a ferry crossing on the Columbia River in Lincoln County, Washington. Established in 1892 when homesteaders needed reliable passage between the wheat fields of the Big Bend and the rail lines to the west. At its peak in the 1920s, Govan had a population of just under 200, a post office, a general store, a one-room schoolhouse, and a ferry that ran 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The town existed because of the river. When the river changed, Govan disappeared. Construction of the Grand Coulee Dam began in 1933. The dam would create Franklin D. Roosevelt Lake, a reservoir stretching 151 miles upstream, flooding valleys, canyons, and more than 20 small communities. Govan was one of them. Residents were given notice in 1941. Most families relocated to Wilbur or Coulee City. By June of that year, the town was officially evacuated. The buildings were dismantled or abandoned. The ferry ceased operation on June 19th. The reservoir began filling in 1942. Today, Govan is underwater, except for one dock. It stands on the eastern shore of the reservoir, north of where the town used to be, a skeletal structure of weathered wood and rusted bolts that somehow survived 80 years of wind, water, and neglect. The dock extends 30 feet from the shore, its pilings driven deep into what was once dry ground. It should have collapsed decades ago. Instead, it remains intact, accessible, and avoided by nearly everyone who knows it's there. The first documented incident occurred in July of 1958. A fisherman named Carl Benson and his teenage son were trolling for walleye near the Govan site when their outboard motor died. They drifted toward the dock, which Benson recognized from old maps as part of the original ferry landing. He tied up, intending to check the motor. According to the incident report filed with the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office 3 days later, Benson's compass began spinning the moment they secured the boat. Benson described the compass as unreadable, the needle rotating continuously without pattern or pause. He assumed it was a malfunction and retrieved a backup compass from his tackle box. It behaved the same way. His son tried a third compass, a small handheld model. Same result. Benson untied the boat and pushed off. Within minutes, all 3 compasses returned to normal function. Benson mentioned the incident to a dock attendant at Keller Ferry, 20 miles south. The attendant, a man named Eugene Vasquez, said he'd heard similar stories about the Govan dock but had never investigated. Benson didn't pursue the matter further, though he avoided the area in subsequent fishing trips. His son, however, mentioned something else in a later interview conducted by a local historian in 2006. He said they'd heard voices while tied up, children's, voices calling from somewhere near the shore, asking if they could cross the river. When he and his father looked, no one was there. Over the following decades, reports accumulated slowly, mostly through word of mouth among fishermen and boaters who frequented Roosevelt Lake. The pattern was consistent: compasses malfunctioning near the dock, voices heard but never sourced, and a pervasive sense of unease that intensified the longer someone remained tied up. A fishing guide named Patricia Morales, who worked out of Keller Ferry in the 1980s, said she warned clients away from the dock as a matter of policy. "I've been guiding on this lake for 30 years, Morales said in a 1997 interview with the Spokesman Review. "I've tied up at that dock twice. Both times something felt wrong. I can't explain it better than that. The second time, I heard kids talking, clear as anything. I thought maybe there were people hiking the shore, but when I looked, there was no one. I haven't been back since." Morales also noted that her fish finder, an electronic sonar device used to locate fish underwater, displayed erratic readings near the dock, showing depth fluctuations that didn't align with known topography. She said other guides reported the same issue, and most had stopped fishing that section of the lake entirely. In 2001, a group of recreational divers exploring submerged historical sites in Roosevelt Lake decided to investigate the area around the Govan dock. The team, led by a diver named James Kowalski, was interested in documenting remnants of the old town. They descended near the dock on a clear afternoon in August, equipped with underwater cameras and metal detectors. Kowalski's video footage, later uploaded to a historical preservation website, shows the divers exploring the lake bed approximately 20 feet below the surface. The water is murky, but the outlines of foundations and roadbeds are visible. At one point, Kowalski's camera captures something unusual: a line of small objects arranged in a row along what appears to be the old shoreline. The objects are difficult to identify on the grainy footage, but Kowalski later described them as children's shoes, leather, old-fashioned, and partially buried in silt. Kowalski retrieved one of the shoes and brought it to the surface. It was a child's shoe, size small, consistent with styles from the 1930s or 40s. He reported the find to the Washington State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, assuming it might be of historical interest. The department acknowledged the report but took no action. Kowalski returned to the site twice more, but found no additional artifacts. The shoe he retrieved was donated to the Lincoln County Historical Society, where it remains in storage. What troubled Kowalski more than the shoe was something he couldn't capture on camera. He said that while underwater near the dock, his dive computer malfunctioned. Depth readings fluctuated wildly, and his compass spun without stopping. He also reported hearing sounds underwater, which he described as rhythmic and vocal, though he acknowledged that sound transmission underwater is often distorted and difficult to interpret. His dive partner, a woman named Rebecca Osterman, corroborated the compass issue, but said she heard nothing unusual. The Lincoln County Sheriff's Office was asked to investigate the Govan Dock in 2009 after a boater called in a disturbance report. The caller, whose name was redacted in public records, said he'd tied up at the dock overnight and had been awakened by voices, specifically children asking to be taken across the river. When he went outside to look, he saw no one. The caller left immediately and reported the incident the following morning. Deputy Officer Nathan Pruitt visited the site later that week. His report, filed on September 12, 2009, describes the dock as structurally unstable but still standing, and notes no evidence of recent human activity. Pruitt did not mention testing a compass or experiencing any anomalies. However, in a follow-up interview conducted for a regional podcast in 2017, Pruitt acknowledged that he'd heard something while at the dock, faint voices, possibly children, though he couldn't determine the source. He said he assumed it was an acoustic trick caused by wind or water, and he didn't include it in his official report. Efforts to study the phenomenon scientifically have been minimal. In 2012, a graduate student from Eastern Washington University named Laura Dietrich requested permission to conduct geomagnetic surveys around the Govan Dock as part of her thesis on magnetic anomalies in reservoir environments. Her proposal was approved by the university, but required additional permits from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, which manages Roosevelt Lake. The permits were never granted. Dietrich's thesis, completed without fieldwork at Govan, included a section noting that institutional barriers prevented investigation of reported anomalies. A separate attempt in 2015 by a team of amateur researchers yielded limited results. The group, affiliated with a paranormal investigation website, visited the dock with electromagnetic field detectors, digital audio recorders, and video equipment. They documented compass malfunctions consistent with previous reports and recorded audio that they claimed contained voices, though the quality was poor and the content ambiguous. The recordings were posted online and attracted modest attention, but no academic scrutiny. Local historians have attempted to determine whether children died in Govan or the surrounding area during the town's evacuation, which might explain the recurring reports of children's voices. Records from the Lincoln County Clerk's Office show no deaths of minors in Govan between 1935 and 1941. The schoolhouse, which closed in 1940, had 12 enrolled students in its final year, all of whom relocated with their families. No missing persons cases were filed in connection with the evacuation. However, one detail remains unresolved. A letter held by the Lincoln County Historical Society, written in May of 1941 by a Govan resident named Helen Fairbanks, mentions that several children were playing near the ferry dock on the day before the final crossing. Fairbanks wrote that the children were upset about leaving and asked the ferryman if they could ride across one more time. The ferryman, whose name is not mentioned, reportedly declined, saying the ferry was no longer in service. Fairbanks does not identify the children, and no follow-up correspondence exists. The dock remains standing. Boaters still avoid it. Compasses still malfunction within 50 feet. And on calm days when the wind dies and the water stills, some who pass close enough say they hear them, the voices of children asking for passage to the other side. No one knows who they are. No one knows why they're still waiting, and no one ties up long enough to find out. Some images develop before they're taken. Nighthawk sits in the northernmost reaches of Okanogan County, Washington, less than 2 miles from the Canadian border. The town was founded in 1898 during a brief gold rush along the Similkameen River. By 1910, the mines had played out, and most residents left. A few families stayed through the Depression, working small claims and subsistence farms, but by 1950, Nighthawk was effectively abandoned. What remains today is a scattering of wooden structures in various states of collapse. A general store, a blacksmith shop, several cabins, and the stone foundation of what used to be a stamp mill. The area is managed by the Bureau of Land Management, which maintains minimal presence. Few people visit. Fewer stay long. In late September of 2003, a BLM ranger named Vincent Galloway was conducting a routine survey of historical structures in the Nighthawk area when he noticed something unusual near one of the older cabins, a small metal lockbox, partially buried beneath a collapsed section of roof. The box was rusted but intact, approximately 12 inches long and 8 inches wide, secured with a corroded padlock. Galloway reported the find to his supervisor and received permission to open it. Inside were photographs, Polaroids to be exact, 237 of them, stacked in chronological order according to handwritten dates on the backs. The dates ranged from April 19, 1975 to August 3, 1979. Every photograph showed the same subject, a small single-room cabin with a peaked roof and a single door facing east. The cabin was empty in all but one of the images. The angles varied slightly, some taken from the front, others from the side, a few from a distance, but the subject never changed. No people, no vehicles, just the cabin, in different light, at different times of year. Galloway documented the find and submitted the box and its contents to the BLM's regional office in Spokane. An archivist there, a woman named Rebecca Alvarado, cataloged the photographs and cross-referenced them with known structures in the Nighthawk area. She identified the cabin in the images as Structure 14, a designation assigned during a 1986 survey. The cabin still stood, though barely. Alvarado visited the site in October of 2003 to verify. The structure matched the photographs exactly. Same door, same roofline, same orientation. It was located approximately 300 yards northwest of the main cluster of buildings, accessible only by an overgrown footpath. What troubled Alvarado was the final photograph. It was dated August 3, 1979, and it differed from the others in one critical way. A figure stood in the doorway. The figure was human-shaped, dark and indistinct, as if photographed in shadow or at dusk. Alvarado could not determine gender, age, or clothing. The figure faced the camera but had no visible features. She noted in her report that the image quality was consistent with the other Polaroids, slightly faded, with the characteristic color shift of 1970s film stock, but the figure itself seemed out of place, almost superimposed. Curious, Alvarado contacted a forensic imaging specialist at Washington State University, Dr. Isaiah Foster, and asked him to examine the photograph. Foster's analysis, completed in December of 2003, produced unsettling results. According to his report, the figure in the doorway was not added after the photograph was developed. It was present in the negative itself, embedded in the emulsion before exposure. Foster explained that Polaroid film develops instantly through a chemical process initiated when the image is ejected from the camera. It is not possible to alter a Polaroid negative after the fact without destroying the image entirely. Foster concluded that the figure was either present when the photograph was taken, meaning someone was standing in the doorway in 1979, or the film itself was defective in a way that created a human-shaped artifact. He noted, however, that he had never encountered a film defect of that specificity. He also pointed out something else. The figure's position in the frame was precisely centered, suggesting intentional composition, not random chance. Alvarado attempted to locate the person who had taken the photographs. The lockbox contained no identification, no notes, and no other personal items. She contacted the Okanogan County Sheriff's Office to see if any missing persons cases from the late 1970s might be connected to Nighthawk. None were. She also reached out to local historians and former residents of the area. Most had no knowledge of anyone living in Nighthawk during that period, though one elderly man, a former miner named Harold Brennan, recalled seeing a vehicle parked near the town in the mid-70s, a green pickup truck, though he couldn't remember the make or year. Brennan said he'd assumed it belonged to a transient prospector or someone scouting for salvage. He never saw the driver. A journalist from the Wenatchee World, David Kowalski, heard about the photographs in 2004 and wrote a feature article. The piece included several of the images, including the final one with the figure in the doorway. Kowalski interviewed Alvarado and Foster, and he visited Nighthawk to photograph Structure 14 himself. In his article, he noted that the cabin was in advanced decay, the roof had partially collapsed, and the door hung from a single hinge. He also mentioned something Alvarado had not included in her official report. The interior of the cabin was completely empty except for a single wooden chair positioned in the center of the room facing the door. Kowalski's article prompted responses from several readers, including a woman named Margaret Sutherland Sutherland, who contacted him in March of 2004. Sutherland said her brother, a photographer named Peter Sutherland, had lived in Okanogan County in the 1970s and had spent time in remote areas documenting abandoned structures. She said Peter had disappeared in August of 1979 while on a solo trip to the northern part of the county. His truck, a green Ford Ranger, was found 3 weeks later near the Canadian border, empty and unlocked, with no sign of Peter. The case was never solved. Margaret provided Kowalski with a photograph of her brother. He was in his late 20s at the time of his disappearance, with dark hair and a slender build. Kowalski shared the photograph with Alvarado, who compared it to the figure in the doorway. The resolution was too poor to make a definitive match, but the proportions were consistent. Margaret also mentioned that Peter had used a Polaroid camera, a model SX70 popular in the 70s, and that he often documented his visits to remote locations by taking multiple photographs from different angles. Alvarado forwarded this information to the Okanogan County Sheriff's Office, which reopened Peter Sutherland's missing persons case in May of 2004. A deputy, Officer Laura Moreno, reviewed the original case file and conducted a follow-up investigation. She visited Nighthawk and examined Structure 14. Her report, filed in June of 2004, noted that the cabin was unlikely to have been inhabited in 1979 due to its condition, but she acknowledged that someone could have visited it temporarily. She also noted that the chair inside the cabin appeared to be older than 1979, based on its construction and wear, though she could not determine its exact age. Moreno also contacted Peter Sutherland's former roommate, a man named Thomas Vasquez, who had been interviewed during the original investigation in 1979. Vasquez said Peter had been obsessed with a particular cabin near Nighthawk in the months before his disappearance. Peter had visited it multiple times and had talked about documenting it thoroughly before it collapsed. Vasquez said Peter believed the cabin had historical significance, though he never explained why. Vasquez also mentioned that Peter had been developing a project involving sequential photography, taking pictures of the same subject over an extended period to document change over time. The case was closed again in July of 2004 due to lack of evidence. Moreno's final report stated that while the photographs may have been taken by Peter Sutherland, there was no conclusive proof, and the figure in the doorway could not be positively identified. The lockbox and its contents were returned to the BLM and eventually transferred to the Okanogan County Historical Society, where they remain in storage. In 2009, a researcher from the University of Washington named Dr. Evelyn Pritchard examined the photographs as part of a study on analog photography and temporal documentation. Pritchard was particularly interested in the sequential nature of the images and the fact that they spanned more than 4 years. She analyzed the metadata encoded in the Polaroid chemistry and confirmed that the dates written on the backs of the photographs were consistent with the film's age. She also noted something Foster had not. The lighting in the photographs suggested they were all taken at approximately the same time of day, late afternoon, based on shadow angles, despite being taken across multiple seasons and years. Pritchard visited Nighthawk in October of 2009 and spent several hours at Structure 14. She took her own photographs from angles matching those in the Polaroids. She also measured the position of the sun at different times of day and compared it to the shadows in the original images. Her findings supported her earlier observation. The photographs were taken with remarkable consistency, as if the photographer had returned to the same spot at the same time of day, repeatedly over 4 years. Pritchard also examined the chair inside the cabin. She found nothing unusual about it other than its placement. It faced the door directly, positioned in such a way that someone sitting in it would be centered in the frame of any photograph taken from outside. Pritchard noted this in her research, but offered no interpretation. The photographs remain unexplained. Peter Sutherland was never found. Structure 14 collapsed entirely in 2015 during a winter storm. The chair, however, was recovered by a BLM ranger and is now held by the Okanogan County Historical Society along with the lockbox and the Polaroids. The figure in the doorway has never been identified. Forensic analysis confirmed it was present in the original negative embedded in the film before development. If Peter Sutherland took the photograph, he captured an image of someone, or something, that was there on August 3, 1979. If he didn't take it, then someone else did. Either way, the figure knew where to stand, and it was waiting. Some work continues long after the workers are gone. Carbonado sits in the Carbon River Valley of Pierce County, Washington, 16 miles southeast of Enumclaw. The town was established in 1880 when prospectors discovered high-grade anthracite coal in the foothills of Mount Rainier. By 1890, Carbonado had grown into one of the most productive mining towns in the Pacific Northwest, with a population exceeding 1,500. The mines ran deep, some tunnels extended more than 3,000 feet into the mountainside, and the work was dangerous. Cave-ins, gas leaks, and flooding were constant threats. Between 1880 and 1937, 17 documented accidents claimed the lives of 43 miners. The final disaster occurred on March 11, 1937. A tunnel known as Shaft 7 collapsed during the morning shift, trapping 11 men approximately 2,000 feet underground. Rescue efforts continued for 9 days, but the instability of the surrounding rock made recovery impossible. The mine was permanently sealed on March 20th. The bodies were never retrieved. The company, Pacific Coast Coal, closed operations in Carbonado later that year, citing unsafe conditions and declining demand. By 1940, most families had left. The town survived in diminished form, sustained by logging and small-scale agriculture, but the mines remained closed and largely forgotten. Then, in April of 1989, something changed. A seismologist from the University of Washington named Dr. Alan Pritchard was conducting a routine survey of microseismic activity in the Cascade foothills when his equipment detected unusual vibrations near Carbonado. The readings were rhythmic and consistent, occurring in intervals that did not match natural seismic patterns. Pritchard initially assumed the signals were caused by industrial activity, logging equipment, or road construction. But when he cross-referenced local permits, he found no active projects in the area. Pritchard visited Carbonado on April 23, 1989, and installed additional monitoring equipment near the sealed entrance to Shaft 7. Over the next 2 weeks, his instruments recorded a pattern. The vibrations occurred every weekday between 6 a.m. and 2 p.m., with a 1-hour break at noon. They did not occur on weekends. The frequency and amplitude of the vibrations were consistent with mechanical impact, something striking stone at regular intervals, approximately 1 blow per second. Pritchard's initial report, submitted to the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network in May of 1989, described the phenomenon as anomalous but likely anthropogenic in origin. He suggested the vibrations could be caused by underground water movement, settling rock, or residual structural adjustments in the sealed mine. However, his data included a detail he could not explain. The vibrations followed an 8-hour workday schedule 5 days a week, with no deviation. A graduate student working with Pritchard, a woman named Susan Morales, noted another pattern. She compared the rhythm of the vibrations to historical accounts of coal mining techniques used in Carbonado during the early 20th century. Miners worked in pairs, alternating pickaxe strikes to maximize efficiency. The cadence was distinctive, 1 strike per second, 2 miners per team, creating a steady, overlapping rhythm. Morales analyzed Pritchard's data and found that the vibrations matched this pattern almost exactly. Pritchard was skeptical. He returned to Carbonado in June of 1989 and installed more sensitive equipment, including geophones capable of detecting vibrations at depths exceeding 3,000 feet. The readings confirmed Morales' observation. The vibrations originated from approximately 2,000 feet below the surface, near the location of the Shaft 7 collapse. Pritchard contacted the Washington State Department of Natural Resources to inquire about abandoned mine activity. The department confirmed that Shaft 7 had been sealed in 1937 and had not been accessed since. Word of Pritchard's findings spread slowly through academic circles, and by 1990, other researchers had taken interest. A geologist from Oregon State University, Dr. Raymond Teller, visited Carbonado in September of that year and conducted his own seismic survey. Teller's equipment recorded the same vibrations, though he noted that the signal strength varied depending on atmospheric conditions, stronger on clear days, weaker during rain. He proposed that the vibrations might be caused by thermal expansion and contraction of rock layers, amplified by the empty mine shafts acting as resonance chambers. However, Teller acknowledged that thermal effects would not explain the consistent 8-hour daily pattern or the cessation of activity on weekends. Local residents were aware of the phenomenon, but largely indifferent. A man named Frank Kowalski, who had lived in Carbonado since the 1950s, said the sounds had been part of the town's background for as long as he could remember. He described them as knocking or tapping, audible on quiet mornings near the old mine entrance. Kowalski said his father, a former miner, had mentioned hearing similar sounds in the years immediately after the mine closed, though his father attributed them to settling timbers and shifting rock. Another resident, a woman named Margaret Halstead, operated a small antique shop in Carbonado and had heard the sounds frequently. She said they were loudest in the spring and fall and that visitors occasionally asked about them. Halstead described the rhythm as steady, like someone working, and said it reminded her of stories her grandfather had told about the mines. Her grandfather, Thomas Halstead, had worked in Shaft 7 before the collapse and had survived, because he was on a different shift that day. He died in 1963, but Margaret said he'd never spoken about the accident in detail, only that the men are still down there. In 1994, a documentary filmmaker named Aaron Bledsoe visited Carbonado to record the vibrations for a project on abandoned mining towns. Bledsoe brought audio recording equipment and spent 3 days near the sealed entrance to Shaft 7. His recordings, later deposited with the Washington State Historical Society, captured the rhythmic sounds clearly, low, resonant impacts occurring at intervals of approximately 1 second, with occasional pauses that suggested shifts in activity or repositioning. Bledsoe described the experience as unsettling, not because the sounds were loud, but because they were so regular. Bledsoe also interviewed several longtime residents, including a retired logger named Vincent Sutherland, who said the sounds had been going on for decades and that most people in town had learned to ignore them. Sutherland mentioned that his uncle, a miner who had worked in Carbonado in the 1920s, used to say the mines remembered the work. When Bledsoe asked what that meant, Sutherland said his uncle believed the mines retained some kind of residual energy from the years of labor, like an echo that never faded. Attempts to investigate the sealed mine directly were unsuccessful. In 1996, the Pierce County Department of Emergency Management received a request from a team of engineers who wanted to assess the structural integrity of Shaft 7 and, if possible, enter the mine to locate the source of the vibrations. The request was denied on safety grounds. The department's response, dated July 12, 1996, stated that the mine was structurally unsound and that entry posed significant risk of further collapse. No alternative investigation methods were proposed. A second request, submitted in 2000 by a group of researchers from the University of British Columbia, was also denied. The researchers wanted to use ground-penetrating radar and advanced seismic imaging to map the interior of the mine without physical entry. The Pierce County Engineers Office, which had jurisdiction over the site, declined the request, citing concerns about liability and the potential for destabilizing the sealed tunnels. No further attempts were made. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, the vibrations continued. Pritchard's monitoring equipment, which remained in place until 2002, recorded the same pattern: 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, with pauses consistent with a workday schedule. The only variation occurred during holidays. No vibrations were recorded on Thanksgiving, Christmas, or New Year's Day, mirroring the days when the mine had historically been closed. Then, on March 20, 2004, exactly 67 years after Shaft 7 was sealed, the vibrations stopped. Pritchard, who had continued to monitor the site remotely, noticed the cessation immediately. He traveled to Carbonado on March 22nd and confirmed that his equipment was functioning properly. The vibrations had simply ended. Pritchard left the monitors in place for another 6 months, but the signals did not resume. In a follow-up report submitted to the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network in October of 2004, Pritchard wrote that the phenomenon had concluded without explanation, and that no natural or mechanical process he was aware of could account for the precise timing of its cessation. Local residents noticed the change as well. Kowalski, who was interviewed again in 2005, said the silence was strange and that he'd grown so accustomed to the sounds that their absence felt like something was missing. Halstead described the town as quieter and said some visitors remarked that Carbonado felt emptier than it used to, though she couldn't explain why. In 2009, a journalist named Laura Dietrich wrote an article for the Tacoma News Tribune about the Carbonado vibrations and their sudden end. Dietrich interviewed Pritchard, Morales, and several residents, and she reviewed the seismic data collected over 15 years. She also contacted descendants of the miners who had died in the Shaft 7 collapse. One woman, whose great-grandfather had been among the 11 men trapped, said her family had always believed the men were still working and that the end of the vibrations meant they had finished. The mine remained sealed. The equipment that once monitored the vibrations has been removed, and Carbonado is quiet now, in a way it wasn't for more than 50 years. But on certain mornings, when the air is still and the valley is silent, some residents say they pause and listen, not because they expect to hear anything, but because the absence of sound feels heavier than the sound itself ever did. Some sounds refuse to be silenced. Renton, Washington, sits at the southern tip of Lake Washington, 10 miles southeast of Seattle. Today, it's a city of over 100,000 people, known for Boeing facilities and suburban development. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Renton was a coal mining town. The mines opened in 1873 and operated for nearly 60 years, extracting bituminous coal from seams beneath the Cedar River Valley. The work was dangerous. Between 1875 and 1931, mine accidents in Renton killed 42 men. The worst of these occurred on March 14, 1911, when a gas explosion in Shaft 3 claimed 17 lives. The First Methodist Church of Renton stood on South 2nd Street, completed in 1896, with donations from mining families and company executives. The church had a modest bell tower 30 feet high, fitted with a bronze bell cast in Pennsylvania. The bell weighed approximately 300 pounds and rang every evening at 6 o'clock to mark the end of the workday. It also tolled for funerals, one ring for each year of the deceased's life, followed by a pause, then one final ring. After the 1911 disaster, the bell rang for 3 days straight as each of the 17 miners was laid to rest. The church remained active until the late 1940s, when membership declined and the building fell into disrepair. The congregation merged with another Methodist church in 1951, and the old building was sold to a developer. It was demolished in May of 1952. According to city records, the bell was removed prior to demolition and sold to a scrap dealer in Seattle. No documentation exists describing what happened to it after that. The site where the church stood is now a parking lot behind a commercial building. The first documented report of the bell ringing after the church's demolition came in March of 1957. A woman named Evelyn Kowalski, who lived on South 3rd Street, contacted the Renton Police Department on the evening of March 14th to report a disturbance. She told the dispatcher that a church bell had been ringing repeatedly for several minutes and that it was disturbing her children. The dispatcher asked which church. Kowalski said it sounded like it was coming from the old Methodist church site, though she knew the church was gone. An officer, Patrolman Raymond Vasquez, was dispatched to investigate. His report, filed later that evening, stated that he arrived at the site at 6:14 p.m. and found it empty and quiet. He noted that Kowalski's home was approximately 2 blocks from the former church location, and that no other residents had called to report the sound. Vasquez concluded that Kowalski had likely heard a bell from another church or a similar sound misidentified due to distance and echo. The case was closed, but Kowalski was not alone. Over the following years, scattered reports surfaced, always on March 14th, always in the evening, always describing the same phenomenon. In 1963, a man named Thomas Brennan called the police to report hearing a church bell ringing near his home on Mill Avenue. In 1968, a couple walking near the Cedar River heard it and mentioned it to a reporter from the Renton Record-Chronicle. The reporter, a woman named Margaret Oakes, looked into the story and found 4 other residents who claimed to have heard the bell on March 14th in previous years. Oakes wrote a brief article about the phenomenon, noting that all the witnesses described the bell as ringing exactly 17 times. Oakes interviewed Evelyn Kowalski, who confirmed that she had heard the bell again in 1962 and 1967, both times on March 14th. Kowalski said she had stopped reporting it to the police after 1957 because no one believed me. She described the sound as clear and deliberate, unlike any other bell she had heard. She said it always began at 6 p.m. and rang 17 times, with approximately 3 seconds between each ring. After the 17th ring, it stopped abruptly. A local historian named Harold Sutherland read Oakes's article and contacted her with additional information. Sutherland had researched the 1911 mine disaster and confirmed that 17 men had died in the explosion. He also noted that the First Methodist Church had tolled its bell 17 times on March 14, 1911, to honor the victims, 1 ring for each man lost. Sutherland suggested that the phenomenon might be a form of collective memory or auditory imprinting, though he acknowledged he had no scientific basis for the theory. Interest in the bell grew slowly over the next 2 decades. Residents began to anticipate it, and some made a point of listening on March 14th each year. Not everyone heard it. Some years, no one reported it at all. But in years when it was heard, the accounts were remarkably consistent. 17 rings, beginning at 6 p.m. Or 6 p.m., audible within a several-block radius of the old church site. In 1984, a sound engineer from Seattle named Vincent Pritchard heard about the phenomenon and decided to investigate. Pritchard set up recording equipment near the former church location on the evening of March 14th. He positioned microphones at 4 different points within a 3-block radius and recorded continuously from 5:30 p.m. to 7 p.m. At 6 p.m., his equipment captured something, a low, resonant sound, consistent with a large bronze bell ringing 17 times. The recordings were clear. Pritchard played them for colleagues, who confirmed that the sound was consistent with a church bell, though they could not identify the source. Pritchard returned in 1985 with more sophisticated equipment, including directional microphones and frequency analyzers. Again, the sound was recorded, 17 rings, beginning at 6 p.m. But this time, Pritchard noticed something unusual. The sound did not originate from a single point. His directional microphones, positioned at different locations, all registered the sound as coming from slightly different directions, as if the source were diffuse or moving. Frequency analysis showed that the sound contained harmonics consistent with a bronze bell, but with an additional low-frequency component that Pritchard could not explain. Pritchard presented his findings at a regional conference on acoustics in 1986. His presentation was met with skepticism. Several attendees suggested that the sound might be a hoax, someone ringing a bell and moving between locations to create the illusion of a phantom source. Pritchard acknowledged the possibility, but pointed out that he had monitored the area visually during both recordings and had seen no one. He also noted that the consistency of the phenomenon occurring on the same date at the same time for decades argued against a simple prank. In 1992, a journalist from the Seattle Times named Laura Dietrich wrote a feature article about the bell. Dietrich interviewed more than 20 Renton residents who claimed to have heard it over the years. Most described the sound in similar terms: deep, resonant, and unmistakable. Several mentioned that the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a phrase that appeared repeatedly in the accounts. Dietrich also spoke with family members of the miners who had died in 1911. One woman, whose grandfather had been killed in the explosion, said her family had always believed the bell was ringing for the men who were never properly mourned. Dietrich attempted to locate the original church bell through historical records and scrap dealer invoices. She contacted the Seattle scrap dealer named in the 1952 demolition records, but the company had gone out of business in 1968, and its records were lost. Dietrich also checked with metal recyclers, foundries, and antique dealers throughout the Pacific Northwest, but no one had any record of a 300-pound bronze bell matching the description. The bell, if it still existed, could not be found. In 2003, the Renton Historical Society received a grant to digitize old city records and photographs. Among the materials archived was a photograph of the First Methodist Church taken in 1948, showing the bell tower and bell clearly visible. The Society also uncovered a handwritten log kept by the church sexton, a man named William Halstead, who had rung the bell every evening from 1905 until the church closed. Halstead's log noted the time and duration of each ringing, and it included an entry for March 14, 1911. Rang the bell 17 times at 6 p.m. for the men lost in the mine. May they rest. The Renton Historical Society made the log and photograph available to researchers, and a copy was provided to Vincent Pritchard, who had continued to monitor the phenomenon intermittently. Pritchard visited Renton on March 14, 2004, and set up equipment once again. The bell rang. Pritchard recorded it, as he had in the 80s, and this time he brought a team of acousticians from the University of Washington to verify his findings. The team confirmed that the sound was consistent with a large bronze bell, and that it could not be localized to a specific source. One team member, Dr. Rebecca Strand, noted in her report that the sound appeared to emanate from the air itself rather than from any physical object. Attempts to explain the phenomenon have been varied and inconclusive. Some researchers have suggested that the sound is a form of infrasound, low-frequency vibrations below the threshold of human hearing that can be perceived as ghostly sounds under certain conditions. Others have proposed that the resonance of the old church bell somehow imprinted itself on the surrounding structures or landscape, creating a kind of acoustic echo that manifests under specific atmospheric conditions. None of these theories account for the precise timing, 6 p.m. on March 14th, or the exact number of rings. In 2018, a team of paranormal investigators from Portland visited Renton and conducted their own investigation. They recorded the bell and interviewed residents, but their findings added little to the existing body of evidence. The team concluded that the phenomenon was unexplained and recommended further study, though no follow-up has been conducted. The bell continues to ring, not every year and not for everyone, but often enough that residents know to listen on March 14th. Some gather near the old church site. Others stay in their homes, windows open, waiting for 6 p.m. When it comes, it's always the same. 17 rings, clear and deliberate, echoing through streets where a church once stood and a disaster is still remembered. The bell was sold for scrap in 1952. No one knows where it went. But every March 14th, at 6 o'clock in the evening, it rings. 17 times, one for each man who never came home. Light doesn't always fall the way it should. Liberty is a ghost town in Catitas County, Washington, tucked into a narrow valley along Swauk Creek in the eastern Cascade Range. The town was established in 1873 after prospectors discovered silver in the surrounding hills. By 1890, Liberty had grown into a community of nearly 200 people, with a main street, a general store, a saloon, and a school. The mines produced steadily for nearly 4 decades, but by the 1920s, the silver had run out. Most families left by 1928. The last resident, a caretaker named Walter Brennan, departed in 1930. The buildings were left standing, and the Forest Service assumed management of the area in 1946. Today, Liberty consists of approximately 15 structures in various states of decay: cabins, the old general store, a few outbuildings, and the foundation of the stamp mill. The town is accessible by a rough dirt road off Highway 97, passable only in summer. It's a popular destination for history enthusiasts and photographers, drawn by the preserved wooden buildings and the quiet isolation of the valley. But some visitors leave unsettled. They notice something that doesn't align with the landscape, something that suggests the light in Liberty behaves differently than it should. The first documented account came in August of 1976. A photographer from Seattle named David Khalil visited Liberty to capture images of abandoned buildings for a book on Washington ghost towns. Khalil spent an afternoon photographing the main street, working in bright midday sun. When he reviewed his negatives later that week, he noticed something unusual. The shadows in several images didn't correspond to the position of the sun. In one photograph taken at approximately 12:30 p.m., the shadow of the general store extended westward toward the sun rather than eastward as it should have. Khalil assumed he'd made an error in his notes or that the film had been mislabeled. But when he returned to Liberty 2 weeks later to reshoot, the same anomaly appeared. This time, he paid closer attention. Standing in front of the general store at noon, he observed his own shadow falling to the west, directly opposite the sun's position. He moved to different locations around the town. In some areas, shadows fell correctly. In others, they didn't. Khalil documented his findings in a letter to the Washington State Historical Society, dated September 19, 1976. He included several photographs showing the shadow discrepancies and requested that someone with expertise in optics or atmospheric phenomena investigate. The society acknowledged receipt of the letter, but took no action. Khalil's photographs were eventually published in his book released in 1978, though he included only a brief caption noting unusual lighting conditions without elaborating. Over the next decade, other visitors reported similar observations. A hiking group from Ellensburg visited Liberty in June of 1983 and mentioned the shadows in a trip report filed with the Forest Service. One member of the group, a high school science teacher named Margaret Oakes, said she'd noticed that shadows near the old schoolhouse pointed in the wrong direction and that the effect persisted regardless of the time of day. Oakes returned in July with a compass and a protractor to measure shadow angles. Her notes, later shared with a local newspaper, indicated that shadows in certain parts of Liberty deviated from expected angles by as much as 90 degrees. A graduate student in physics from the University of Washington, Vincent Sutherland, read about Oakes's findings and visited Liberty in September of 1984. Sutherland brought a theodolite, an instrument used to measure angles, and spent 2 days mapping shadow patterns across the town. His preliminary report, submitted to his faculty advisor, confirmed the anomaly. Sutherland found that shadows in Liberty followed no consistent pattern. Some aligned with the sun's position. Others deviated by 45 to 90 degrees. In a few locations, shadows appeared to point toward structures that were no longer standing, buildings that had collapsed or been removed decades earlier. Sutherland proposed several hypotheses. He considered the possibility of mineral deposits in the soil creating localized magnetic fields that might distort light, though he acknowledged this was physically implausible. He also suggested that atmospheric refraction, caused by temperature gradients or humidity, might be responsible, but refraction typically affects the appearance of distant objects, not shadows cast on the ground. Sutherland's advisor, a physicist named Dr. Raymond Teller, reviewed the findings and advised him to abandon the project, stating that the results were too inconsistent to support meaningful analysis. Sutherland did not publish his research, but he shared his notes with a journalist from the Ellensburg Daily Record, a woman named Laura Dietrich, who wrote a feature article about Liberty's shadow problem in November of 1985. The article included interviews with Khalil, Oakes, and Sutherland, as well as several longtime residents of the Swauk Creek area. One rancher, a man named Harold Pritchard, said his grandfather had lived near Liberty in the early 1900s and had referred to the town as the place where the sun forgets. Pritchard said his grandfather avoided Liberty after dark and discouraged others from visiting, though he never explained why. Dietrich also spoke with a Forest Service ranger named Thomas Vasquez, who was responsible for maintaining the road to Liberty and monitoring visitor activity. Vasquez said he'd heard about the shadows but had never experienced the phenomenon himself. He mentioned that the Forest Service had received occasional complaints from hikers who felt disoriented or uneasy while visiting Liberty, and that some visitors reported difficulty determining the time of day based on the position of the sun. Vasquez said the Forest Service had not conducted any formal investigation but had begun discouraging visits to Liberty due to structural hazards. Interest in the phenomenon grew slowly through the late 1980s and early 1990s. Amateur photographers and paranormal enthusiasts began visiting Liberty specifically to document the shadow anomalies. Some reported success, capturing images showing shadows falling in impossible directions. Others found nothing unusual. The inconsistency frustrated attempts to study the phenomenon systematically. In 1994, a team of researchers from Oregon State University, led by an atmospheric scientist named Dr. Evelyn Strand, requested permission from the Forest Service to conduct a formal study of Liberty's lighting conditions. The request included a proposal to install solar tracking equipment, measure atmospheric composition, and document shadow patterns over a period of several months. The Forest Service denied the request in a letter dated March 7, 1994, citing concerns about environmental impact and visitor safety. No further explanation was provided. Strand appealed the decision and submitted a revised proposal in May of 1994, offering to minimize equipment footprint and coordinate with Forest Service personnel. The appeal was denied in July. Strand contacted the regional office of the U.S. Forest Service to request clarification. In a phone conversation, a representative told her that Liberty was being considered for closure to public access due to structural instability and liability concerns. Strand asked if the closure was related to the shadow phenomenon. The representative said it was not and ended the conversation. Liberty was not closed. Visitors continued to arrive, though the Forest Service removed directional signs from Highway 97, making the town harder to locate. By the late 1990s, Liberty had become something of an underground destination, known primarily through word-of-mouth and online forums dedicated to unusual phenomena. In 2002, a documentary filmmaker named Aaron Bledsoe visited Liberty with a small crew to film a segment on Washington ghost towns. Bledsoe brought professional lighting equipment and spent 3 days documenting the site. His footage, which aired on a regional cable channel in 2003, included several sequences showing shadows behaving anomalously. In one scene, filmed at 2 p.m., shadows cast by crew members fell in multiple directions simultaneously, one shadow extending north, another south, both from the same person. Bledsoe acknowledged in his narration that he could not explain the effect and that it was visible to the naked eye, not just on camera. Bledsoe also interviewed a local historian, a woman named Susan Morales, who had researched Liberty's history for a book on Catitas County mining towns. Morales said she'd found no records of unusual deaths or disasters in Liberty that might explain the phenomenon. The town's closure was economic, not catastrophic, She mentioned, however, that she'd come across a reference in an 1892 journal kept by a miner named William Kowalski. Kowalski wrote that the light in Liberty plays tricks, and that shadows sometimes point to places that aren't there anymore. Morales said she'd assumed the comment was metaphorical, but after visiting Liberty herself, she wasn't certain. In 2007, a team of photographers from a Seattle-based art collective visited Liberty and conducted a coordinated shoot with multiple cameras positioned at different points around the town, all photographing the same subjects at the same time. The resulting images, displayed in a Seattle gallery later that year, showed dramatic inconsistencies. In one set of synchronized photographs, a single building cast three different shadows, east, west, and north, all captured within seconds of each other. The artists described the project as documenting the impossible, but the gallery received little media attention, and the work was not reviewed by scientific publications. Attempts to gain official access to Forest Service records regarding Liberty have been unsuccessful. A Freedom of Information Act request submitted in 2010 by a journalist named Rebecca Halstead sought any documents related to studies, incident reports, or closure proposals involving the Liberty town site. The request was partially fulfilled. The Forest Service provided historical land management records and visitor statistics, but withheld several documents, citing exemptions for internal deliberations and law enforcement records. Halstead appealed. The appeal was denied. In 2015, the Forest Service erected a new sign at the turnoff to Liberty from Highway 97. The sign reads, "Liberty Historic Town Site, unmaintained road, travel not recommended. Visitors proceed at own risk." No mention is made of shadows, lighting, or optical phenomena. The road remains passable in summer, and people still visit, though fewer than in previous decades. Those who do visit often leave with photographs. Some show shadows falling correctly. Others don't. And in a few images, taken by people who weren't looking for anything unusual, who simply wanted a picture of an old building in an empty valley, the shadows point toward structures that collapsed before the photograph was taken. Buildings that existed only in memory. Places that aren't there anymore. The sun rises and sets over Liberty the same as it does everywhere else, but the shadows remember something different, and no one has been able to explain why. Some mail never reaches its destination because it was never meant to arrive. Bossburg sits on the eastern bank of the Columbia River in Stevens County, Washington, 6 miles south of the Canadian border. The town was founded in 1896 during a brief gold rush in the nearby Huckleberry Mountains. By 1900, Bossburg had grown to a population of nearly 800, with a main street, several hotels, a newspaper, and regular ferry service across the river. But the gold played out quickly. By 1920, most residents had left, and the town's population had fallen below 100. The ferry stopped running in 1948. The post office closed in 1960. By 1970, Bossburg was functionally abandoned. A handful of buildings, a few seasonal residents, and a road that led mostly to nowhere. One structure remained conspicuous, a row of 12 metal mailboxes mounted on a wooden frame at the edge of the main road, approximately 200 yards from where the post office used to stand. The mailboxes were standard rural units, the kind installed throughout the Pacific Northwest in the 1940s and 50s. Each had a metal door with a simple latch, painted white originally, though the paint had long since flaked away to rust. The frame was weathered but intact. The mailboxes had no names on them, only numbers, 1 through 12. For decades, the mailboxes stood empty and unused, a relic of a town that no longer needed mail service. Locals occasionally walked past them. Hikers and fishermen used the road to access the river. No one paid much attention. Then, in August of 1997, a United States Postal Service inspector named Gregory Tanner was conducting a routine audit of rural routes in northeastern Washington when he noticed the mailboxes listed on an outdated route map. The map indicated that Bossburg had been serviced by rural carrier until 1960, but Tanner couldn't find any record of the mailboxes being officially decommissioned or removed. Curious, Tanner drove to Bossburg on August 14, 1997. He found the mailboxes easily. They were the only structures still standing on the main road. All 12 doors were closed, and several appeared to be rusted or corroded shut. Tanner tried to open them. Most were stuck. He returned to his vehicle, retrieved a pry bar, and forced open mailbox number 3. Inside were letters, 7 of them stacked neatly, still in their envelopes. The envelopes were yellowed with age, and the paper was brittle. Tanner examined the postmarks. Each letter was dated between 1952 and 1958. The letters were addressed to residents of Bossburg, names Tanner didn't recognize. He opened mailbox number 5. 6 more letters, similarly aged, similarly addressed. He opened the rest. Every mailbox contained letters, ranging from 3 to 9 per box. In total, 72 letters. Tanner documented the find and contacted the regional postal office in Spokane. He was instructed to bring the letters to the office for inspection. On August 15th, Tanner delivered the letters to his supervisor, a woman named Patricia Kowalski, who examined them and immediately noted something unusual. The letters were not only old, they were impossible. One letter, addressed to a man named Walter Brennan, was postmarked October 4, 1954. Kowalski cross-referenced the name with postal records and found that Walter Brennan had been a resident of Bossburg and had received mail at Rural Route 2, Box 7, until his death on September 11, 1954. The letter was postmarked 3 weeks after Brennan died. Kowalski checked the other names. She found similar discrepancies. A letter addressed to Margaret Sutherland was postmarked July 7, 1956. Sutherland had died in May of that year. A letter to Thomas Halstead was dated August 19, 1957. Halstead had died in June. In total, 18 of the 72 letters were addressed to people who had died before the letters were postmarked. The remaining letters were addressed to individuals Kowalski could not identify. Either the names had been recorded incorrectly or the people had left no trace in postal or public records. Kowalski opened several of the letters to examine their contents. Most were brief and mundane: personal correspondence, bills, notifications. One letter addressed to Brennan and dated October 4, 1954, was a handwritten note from a woman who identified herself as his sister. She wrote that she was sorry to hear about your illness and hoped he was feeling better soon. Brennan had died of a heart attack. There had been no prolonged illness. The letter made no sense. Kowalski forwarded the letters to the Postal Inspection Service's regional headquarters in Seattle, along with a detailed report of the findings. The case was assigned to a senior inspector named Vincent Pritchard, who reviewed the materials and interviewed Tanner. Pritchard's initial assessment, filed on September 2, 1997, noted that the letters appeared genuine, authentic postmarks, correct postage rates for the periods in question, and no obvious signs of forgery. However, the timeline discrepancies suggested either a clerical error in the death records or some form of deliberate tampering. Pritchard traveled to Bossburg on September 12 to inspect the mailboxes himself. He brought a colleague, an inspector named Laura Dietrich, and they spent several hours examining the site. Dietrich noted that the mailboxes showed no signs of recent tampering. The rust and corrosion were consistent with decades of exposure to the elements. She also observed that the letters had been stacked neatly, as if deliberately placed, rather than carelessly shoved inside. Pritchard tested the latches and found that most were difficult to open due to rust. It seemed unlikely that someone could have placed the letters inside recently without leaving visible marks. Pritchard contacted the Stevens County Clerk's office to verify the death records. The office confirmed the dates and causes of death for Brennan, Sutherland, Halstead, and the other individuals identified in Kowalski's report. No errors were found. Pritchard also contacted surviving family members of some of the deceased. One woman, the daughter of Margaret Sutherland, confirmed that her mother had died in May of 1956, and that the family had received no mail addressed to her after that date. When Pritchard told her about the letter postmarked in July, she said it was impossible and declined to comment further. Pritchard's investigation expanded to include interviews with former postal carriers who had serviced the Boasberg route. He located a retired carrier named Harold Vasquez, who had worked the route from 1948 to 1960. Vasquez said he remembered the mailboxes and confirmed that he had delivered mail to them regularly until the post office closed. He also said that he had personally cleared the mailboxes on his final route in June of 1960 and that they had been empty. Vasquez was certain of this because he'd been instructed to ensure no mail was left behind. Pritchard asked Vasquez if he'd ever noticed anything unusual about the Boasberg route. Vasquez hesitated, then said that other carriers had occasionally mentioned odd deliveries, mail that appeared in the boxes without having been delivered, or letters that seemed out of place. Vasquez said he'd dismissed these comments as mistakes or jokes, but he acknowledged that he'd once found a letter in a mailbox that he was certain he hadn't delivered. He couldn't remember the details, only that it had bothered him enough that he'd mentioned it to the postmaster, who told him not to worry about it. Pritchard also interviewed a local historian, a woman named Rebecca Oakes, who had researched Boasberg's history for a book on Stevens County ghost towns. Oakes said she'd heard stories about the mailboxes from older residents, claims that mail would occasionally appear in them long after the post office had closed, or that letters would be found addressed to people who no longer lived in the area. Oakes said she'd assumed the stories were exaggerations or local folklore, but when Pritchard told her about the letters, she said it confirmed something she'd suspected, that Boasberg had unfinished business. Pritchard's final report, submitted to the Postal Inspection Service on October 19, 1997, concluded that the letters were genuine but could not be explained through conventional means. He recommended that the mailboxes be removed or secured to prevent further public access. The report was classified as internal use only and was not released to the public. Pritchard was reassigned to a different region shortly thereafter. When contacted years later by a journalist, he declined to discuss the case. In November of 1997, a crew from the Postal Service visited Boasberg and welded the mailbox doors shut. No public announcement was made. The mailboxes remain in place, rusted and sealed, on the edge of the main road. A small sign was installed nearby reading, "Property of USPS, do not tamper." In 2003, a journalist from the Spokesman Review named Aaron Bledsoe heard about the incident through a retired postal worker and attempted to investigate. Bledsoe filed a Freedom of Information Act request for Pritchard's report and any related documents. The request was denied on the grounds that the materials contained information related to ongoing investigations. Bledsoe appealed. The appeal was denied. Bledsoe visited Boasberg and photographed the mailboxes, noting that they had been welded shut and that no explanation was provided for the alteration. Bledsoe also spoke with a few longtime residents of the area, including a man named Thomas Morales, who had lived near Boasberg in the 1950s. Morales said he remembered the mailboxes and that people used to talk about them as if they were haunted or cursed. He said his father had told him never to put mail in them after the post office closed because it wouldn't go where it was supposed to. Morales didn't know what his father meant, and he'd never asked. In 2011, an amateur researcher named Susan Halstead, unrelated to Thomas Halstead, the deceased recipient, visited Boasberg and attempted to document the mailboxes. She found them welded shut, as reported, but noticed something else. Fresh scratches on the metal surface of mailbox number 7, as if someone had recently tried to pry it open. Halstead took photographs and posted them online. The images attracted modest attention, but no official investigation followed. The letters remain in the possession of the United States Postal Service, stored at an undisclosed location. Pritchard's report remains classified. The mailboxes remain welded shut. And no one has explained how 72 letters, postmarked decades ago, ended up in mailboxes that were supposed to be empty, addressed to people who were already dead when the letters were mailed. Bossburg is quiet now. The river still flows past the town. The road still leads to the mailboxes. And if you stand there long enough in the late afternoon when the light fades and the wind picks up, you might notice something. The way the metal doors seem to press outward slightly, as if something inside is trying to get out. Some fruit grows in defiance of every natural law. Bridgeport Bar is a ghost town in Douglas County, Washington, situated on the western shore of the Columbia River near the town of Bridgeport. The settlement was established in the 1920s to support workers building the Chief Joseph Dam, though a small farming community had existed there since the late 1800s. By 1952, when dam construction ended and the reservoir began filling, most residents had relocated. The few remaining structures, a schoolhouse, a general store, and several farmhouses, were either demolished or left to decay. The area is now managed by the Bureau of Reclamation and is accessible only by an unmarked dirt road off Highway 17. Approximately half a mile south of the old town site, set back from the road in a shallow basin surrounded by sagebrush, stands an apple orchard. The orchard consists of 24 trees arranged in 4 rows of 6. The trees are mature, with thick trunks and well-established root systems, suggesting they were planted decades ago. Yet despite the absence of irrigation, pruning, or any form of human maintenance since the 1950s, the trees remain healthy. They produce leaves, blossoms, gum, and fruit, but not when they should. The first documented observation came in October of 1978. A geologist from Washington State University named Dr. Alan Pritchard was conducting a soil survey near Bridgeport Bar when he noticed the orchard. It was mid-autumn, and the trees were in full bloom, covered in white blossoms more typical of early spring. Pritchard found this unusual, as apple trees in eastern Washington typically bloom in April or May. He took photographs and noted the location, intending to return later to investigate further. Pritchard returned in January of 1979. The trees were bearing fruit. Large red apples hung from the branches, fully ripe, despite temperatures well below freezing and several inches of snow on the ground. Pritchard collected samples, 3 apples and several leaves, and brought them back to his lab for analysis. He also contacted the Douglas County Agricultural Extension Office to ask if anyone was aware of the orchard or had records of its planting. No one did. The apples were examined by a botanist at the university, Dr. Susan Morales, who confirmed that they were indeed apples, though she noted several irregularities. The fruit was unusually dense, with flesh that resisted bruising even when subjected to significant pressure. The skin was thicker than normal, and the seeds inside were smaller and darker than those of common apple varieties. Morales attempted to identify the cultivar using a reference database of known apple varieties. No match was found. Pritchard and Morales returned to the orchard in April of 1979, expecting to find the trees in bloom. Instead, the trees were leafless and dormant as if still in winter. They visited again in July. The trees were in full leaf, but there were no blossoms and no fruit. By October, the cycle had begun again. Blossoms appeared out of season, followed by fruit in January. The pattern repeated in 1980, 1981, and every year thereafter. Word of the orchard spread slowly through academic circles. In 1983, a horticulturist from Oregon State University named Dr. Raymond Teller visited the site to conduct his own assessment. Teller confirmed the unusual blooming and fruiting cycle and took additional samples for genetic analysis. His findings, published in a regional agricultural journal in 1984, indicated that the trees were genetically distinct from all known apple cultivars. Teller described them as an unclassified variety, possibly a natural hybrid, though he acknowledged that the blooming schedule defied explanation. Teller also noted something intuitive. The orchard had no irrigation system, and the soil in the area was dry and alkaline, unsuitable for apple cultivation. Yet the trees showed no signs of water stress. Their leaves were green and healthy, and the fruit was plump and fully developed. Teller suggested that the trees might be accessing groundwater from an unusually shallow aquifer, though soil tests did not support this hypothesis. Local residents were aware of the orchard, though most avoided it. A rancher named Harold Vasquez, whose property bordered the old Bridgeport bar site, said his grandfather had told him about the orchard when he was a child. The grandfather, who had lived in the area in the 1940s, claimed the trees had been planted by a farmer named Walter Brennan, who had owned a small homestead near the town site. According to the grandfather, Brennan had left the area suddenly in 1952, just before the dam reservoir began filling. No one knew where he went. Vasquez said his family had never eaten fruit from the orchard, even during lean years when food was scarce. When asked why, Vasquez said his grandfather had warned him that the apples weren't right and that people who ate them felt strange afterward. Vasquez did not elaborate, and he declined to try the fruit himself when offered a sample by researchers. Another longtime resident, a woman named Margaret Halstead, who had lived in Bridgeport since the 1960s, said she'd heard similar warnings. Halstead recalled that a neighbor had once picked apples from the orchard in the early 1970s and brought them home. The neighbor ate one and became violently ill, not with food poisoning, but with what she described as disorientation and confusion. The neighbor said she experienced vivid, intrusive memories that didn't belong to her, images of places she'd never been and people she'd never met. Halstead said the neighbor recovered after a few days, but refused to discuss the incident in detail. In 1991, a graduate student in plant biology from the University of Washington named Vincent Sutherland visited the orchard as part of a research project on cold hardy fruit trees. Sutherland was skeptical of the accounts he'd read and wanted to document the orchard's cycle firsthand. He visited in October and confirmed that the trees were blooming. He returned in January and found them fruiting. Intrigued, he decided to taste one of the apples. Sutherland described the experience in his field notes, dated January 18, 1992. He wrote that the apple tasted normal at first, sweet, slightly tart, with a firm texture. But within minutes, he began to feel what he described as a profound sense of dislocation. He wrote that he experienced a memory of standing in the orchard, but not as himself, as someone else, looking at the trees from a different perspective. The memory was vivid and detailed, but it was not his own. Sutherland left the orchard immediately and did not return. His research project was abandoned. Sutherland shared his notes with his faculty advisor, Dr. Evelyn Strand, who reviewed them and contacted Pritchard and Morales for additional context. Strand decided to visit the orchard herself in March of 1992. She did not eat any of the apples, but she collected extensive samples, fruit, leaves, bark, and soil, for laboratory analysis. Her findings, completed later that year, confirmed what Teller had reported. The trees were genetically unique, and their growth cycle was inexplicable. Strand also conducted a chemical analysis of the fruit. She found elevated levels of certain alkaloids and phenolic compounds, though none were toxic or hallucinogenic in concentrations typical of natural plant material. Strand concluded that the apples were biologically anomalous, but not harmful, though she acknowledged that Sutherland's experience suggested otherwise. Strand recommended further study, but could not secure funding. Her report was filed with the university and not published. In 1996, the Bureau of Reclamation, which managed the land where the orchard was located, received a request from a biotechnology company interested in studying the trees. The company, based in California, wanted to investigate the genetic properties of the apples and explore potential commercial applications. The Bureau denied the request, citing concerns about environmental impact and preservation of historical sites. The company appealed. The appeal was denied in 1997. No explanation was provided. A journalist from the Wenatchee World named Laura Dietrich heard about the orchard in 2000 and wrote a feature article. Dietrich interviewed Pritchard, Morales, Teller, and Strand, and she visited the orchard in October of that year. She confirmed that the trees were blooming out of season just as they had been for decades. Dietrich also spoke with several residents of Bridgeport, all of whom expressed reluctance to eat the fruit. One man, whose name was not included in the article, said the orchard was a place you don't mess with. Dietrich attempted to locate records of Walter Brennan, the farmer allegedly responsible for planting the orchard. She found a land deed dated 1947, listing Brennan as the owner of a small parcel near Bridgeport Bar. The deed was transferred to Douglas County in 1952 when Brennan failed to pay property taxes. No forwarding address was recorded. Dietrich contacted the county assessor's office and the Bureau of Reclamation, but neither had additional information. Brennan's whereabouts remain unknown. In 2009, a team of researchers from a private agricultural institute in Oregon requested permission to conduct a long-term study of the orchard, including the installation of monitoring equipment and the collection of genetic material for sequencing. The Bureau of Reclamation denied the request, stating that the site was not designated for research activities. The researchers appealed, citing the scientific value of the orchard. The appeal was denied in 2010. The Bureau provided no further comment. The orchard continues to grow. Every October, the trees bloom. Every January, they fruit. The apples hang heavy on the branches, red and ripe, in the dead of winter. And no one picks them. Hikers occasionally pass by, drawn by curiosity or the photographs they've seen online. Most take pictures and leave. A few reach out to touch the fruit. Fewer still take one home. But those who eat the apples rarely speak about it afterward. And when they do, they describe the same thing, a memory that doesn't belong to them. A vision of the orchard seen through someone else's eyes, standing among the trees, waiting for something or someone. The memory is brief, but it lingers, and it leaves them with the unsettling sense that the orchard is still tending itself, not for the people who might come, but for the one who never left. Some doors were never meant to be opened. Cle Elum Lake is a reservoir in Kittitas County, Washington, created when the Cle Elum Dam was completed in 1933. The dam was built to provide irrigation and flood control for the Yakima River Valley, and its construction flooded the small logging and coal mining town of Cleland, not to be confused with the nearby town of Cle Elum, which remained above the water line. Cleland had existed since the late 1880s, serving as a supply hub for the Northern Pacific Railway and the local mining operations. By the early 1930s, the town's population had dwindled to fewer than 100 people. When the reservoir began filling, residents were relocated, and the buildings were either demolished or left to sink beneath the rising water. For decades, Cle Elum remained undisturbed at the bottom of the lake. a ghost town submerged under as much as 150 feet of water. The lake became popular for fishing and recreation, but the old town site was largely forgotten. Then, in the late 1970s, recreational diving began to grow in popularity, and divers started exploring the submerged ruins. Most found little of interest: collapsed foundations, scattered timber, rusted mining equipment. But in August of 1981, a dive team from Seattle made a discovery that no one could explain. The team consisted of 4 divers: Michael Pritchard, a marine archaeologist; Laura Dietrich, an underwater photographer; Vincent Kowalski, a geology graduate student; and Thomas Halstead, an experienced technical diver. They had obtained permits from the Washington State Parks and Recreation Commission to document the submerged structures for a historical preservation project. On August 9, 1981, they descended to the southern edge of the old town site, where mining operations had once been active. At a depth of approximately 120 feet, Pritchard noticed something unusual: a stone structure protruding from the lake bed, partially covered in silt and algae. The structure was cylindrical, roughly 6 feet in diameter, and appeared to be the top of a shaft or well. Pritchard signaled to the others, and they began clearing away the sediment. What they uncovered was a spiral staircase, carved from stone, descending into the bedrock beneath the lake. The staircase was intact, with 32 steps spiraling downward in a clockwise direction. The steps were worn smooth, as if they had been used extensively. At the bottom, approximately 40 feet below the lake bed, the staircase ended at an iron door. The door was set into a stone frame and appeared to be sealed with heavy rivets. There was no handle, no lock, and no visible mechanism for opening it. The surface of the door was corroded, but otherwise featureless. Pritchard photographed the staircase and the door, and the team resurfaced to review their findings. None of them had seen anything like Bow. Pritchard consulted historical records and mining maps of the Clelam area, but found no mention of a shaft or staircase in that location. The nearest documented mine was more than half a mile away. Kowalski, who had studied the geology of the region, said the staircase appeared to have been carved directly into the bedrock, a feat that would have required significant effort and expertise. The team returned to the site on August 11th to conduct a more detailed survey. They brought a handheld sonar device to map the area beyond the door. The sonar readings were inconclusive. According to the device, there was no open space beyond the door, only solid rock. Yet the staircase clearly led somewhere, and the door suggested that something had been sealed off intentionally. Dietrich took additional photographs, including close-ups of the door and the staircase. In one image, she captured an inscription carved into the stone frame surrounding the door. The inscription was faint and difficult to read, but Pritchard later identified it as a date: 1897. Below the date was a single word, partially obscured by corrosion: sealed. The team reported their findings to the Washington State Parks and Recreation Commission and submitted a request to conduct further investigation, including an attempt to open or examine the door. The request was forwarded to the Department of Natural Resources, which conducted a preliminary review. In a letter dated September 3, 1981, the department acknowledged the discovery, but stated that any attempt to open the door would require additional permits and consultation with geological and historical experts. Pritchard contacted the Catitas County Historical Society to inquire about the staircase and the inscription. The society had no records of such a structure. A volunteer researcher named Margaret Oakes suggested that the staircase might have been part of an early mining operation, possibly an exploratory shaft that was later abandoned and sealed. However, Oakes noted that 1897 was relatively early in Clelam's history, and there were few records from that period. Pritchard also spoke with a retired miner named Harold Vasquez, who had worked in the Cleveland area in the 1940s and 50s. Vasquez said he had heard stories about sealed tunnels in the region, shafts that had been closed off due to instability or other hazards. But Vasquez had never heard of a spiral staircase, and he said most sealed shafts were filled with rubble, not fitted with iron doors. In October of 1981, Pritchard received permission to conduct a limited follow-up dive. He returned to the site with Kowalski and a sonar technician from the University of Washington named Dr. Rebecca Strand. Strand brought more sophisticated equipment, including a sub-bottom profiler capable of imaging the subsurface geology. The scan confirmed what the handheld sonar had shown. There was no detectable void or cavity beyond the door. The bedrock appeared solid for at least 50 feet in all directions. Strand found this puzzling. She noted that if the staircase had been carved as part of a mining operation, there should be some evidence of excavation, a tunnel, a chamber, or at least a cavity large enough to justify the effort of building the staircase. Instead, the staircase seemed to lead nowhere. Strand suggested that the door might be purely symbolic, a marker or seal placed at the bottom of an exploratory shaft that had been abandoned before any significant excavation took place. But Kowalski disagreed. He pointed out that the staircase was too well crafted to be part of an abandoned project. The steps were evenly spaced, the spiral was geometrically precise, and the door was custom fitted to the frame. Kowalski said it looked like the work of someone who intended the structure to last. He also noted that the inscription, "sealed," suggested that something had been closed off deliberately, not simply abandoned. Pritchard submitted a second request to the Department of Natural Resources, asking for permission to bring in drilling equipment to core a sample of the bedrock beyond the door. The request was denied. In a letter dated November 19, 1981, the department stated that drilling in the lakebed could destabilize the surrounding geology and posed unacceptable environmental risks. The department also noted that the historical significance of the structure had not been established and that further investigation was not warranted. Pritchard appealed the decision, citing the archaeological and historical value of the discovery. The appeal was reviewed by a panel of state officials, including representatives from the Department of Natural Resources, the State Parks Commission, and the Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. In February of 1982, the appeal was denied. The panel concluded that the structure was likely a remnant of early mining activity, and that no compelling evidence exists to justify intrusive investigation. Frustrated, Pritchard contacted a journalist from the Seattle Times named Aaron Bledsoe, who wrote a feature article about the staircase in March of 1982. The article included Dietrich's photographs and interviews with Pritchard, Kowalski, and Strand. It also mentioned the state's refusal to authorize further investigation. The article attracted modest attention, but no public pressure was brought to bear on state officials. In May of 1983, Pritchard and Kowalski made one final dive to the site. They wanted to take measurements and collect additional documentation before moving on to other projects. When they descended to the staircase, they found that the area had been disturbed. The sediment around the structure had been displaced, as if someone had recently been there. More unsettling, the iron door appeared to have shifted slightly, perhaps an inch or two, though it remained closed and sealed. Pritchard reported the disturbance to the Department of Natural Resources, noting that no dive permits had been issued for the site since their last visit. The department launched a brief investigation but found no evidence of unauthorized diving. In a letter dated June 7, 1983, the department suggested that the displacement could have been caused by natural processes, water currents, settling sediment, or seismic activity. The letter also noted that the site would be monitored for further disturbances. In March of 1984, the Washington State Parks and Recreation Commission issued a notice revoking all dive permits for the southern section of Cle Elum Lake, including the area where the staircase was located. The notice cited safety concerns related to unstable lakebed conditions and stated that the closure was temporary pending further assessment. The closure was never lifted. Pritchard attempted to obtain information about the assessment, but his inquiries were met with vague responses. In a phone conversation with a Parks Commission representative in July of 1984, he was told that the assessment was ongoing and that no timeline had been established for reopening the area. When Pritchard asked if the closure was related to the staircase, the representative said it was not and declined to provide further details. Pritchard, Kowalski, and Dietrich discussed making an unauthorized dive to document the site one last time, but they ultimately decided against it. Pritchard said later in an interview conducted for a regional history podcast in 2012 that the decision was made partly out of respect for the regulations, but also because something about the whole situation felt wrong. "We'd found something that clearly mattered to someone," Pritchard said. "The way the state shut us down, the way the permits were revoked, it felt like we'd stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to see. And the fact that the door had moved, I don't know. Maybe it was natural. Maybe it wasn't. But I didn't want to be the one who opened it. The staircase remains at the bottom of Cle Elum Lake, inaccessible to the public, unmapped in any official record. 32 steps descending into bedrock, and an iron door sealed in 1897. And beyond it, according to every scan and survey, nothing but solid stone. But divers who ignore the closure and descend to the site, illegally without permits, sometimes report hearing something when they reach the bottom of the staircase. A low rhythmic sound, like metal striking stone. Faint, but persistent, coming from the other side of the door. Some signals arrive from places that no longer exist. Blewett is not a town, not anymore. It's a name on old maps, a reference point for hikers and historians, a cluster of ruins along the eastern slope of the Cascade Range in Chelan County, Washington. The site sits near the old Blewett Pass, which was bypassed in 1950 when Highway 97 was rerouted to the current Swauk Pass. Blewett began as a mining camp in 1883, briefly flourished during a silver boom, and was abandoned by 1895 when the ore ran out. Today, nothing remains but foundation stones, rusted equipment, and a few wooden structures collapsing into the forest. It's remote, silent, and forgotten, except by a small community of amateur radio operators who have been listening to something they cannot explain. The first report came in March of 2011. A ham radio operator in Wenatchee named Gregory Tanner was scanning frequencies late one evening when he picked up an unusual transmission. The signal was weak but clear, broadcast on a frequency that had been obsolete since the 1960s, around 1.8 megahertz in the lower end of the medium wave band. Most modern transmitters don't operate there anymore. Tanner recorded the transmission and listened back. It was a woman's voice, calm and emotionless, reading a series of numbers and words in a monotone cadence. The transmission lasted approximately 90 seconds. The woman's voice read a set of geographic coordinates, followed by a date, followed by a 4-digit number. Then the transmission looped and repeated. Tanner noted the coordinates 47.3, 29 north, 120.681 west. He looked them up. They pointed to a location near Blewett Pass, in the area where the old mining camp used to be. The date read was April 7, 2011, 3 weeks in the future. The 4-digit number was 2314. Tanner didn't know what it meant. Tanner posted about the transmission on a regional ham radio forum, asking if anyone else had heard it. Within a week, 3 other operators responded. A woman in Ellensburg named Laura Dietrich said she'd picked up the same signal on March 16th and had also recorded it. A man in Leavenworth named Vincent Kowalski confirmed hearing it on March 19th. All three recordings were identical. The same voice, the same coordinates, the same date, the same number. The only difference was the reception quality, which varied depending on the listener's location and equipment. By early April, more operators had tuned in. The signal appeared to broadcast continuously, 24 hours a day, always on the same frequency. On April 7, 2011, the date mentioned in the transmission, several operators drove to the Blewett area to see if anything would happen. Nothing did. The ruins were empty. The forest was quiet. But when they returned home and checked their radios, the transmission had changed. The date now read May 3, 2011. The coordinates remained the same. The 4-digit number had changed to 2407. Over the following months, a pattern emerged. On the first of every month, the transmission updated. The date mentioned always fell approximately 3 to 4 weeks in the future. The 4-digit number changed each time, but no one could determine what it represented. The coordinates never changed. They always pointed to the same location near Blewett. A group of radio enthusiasts, led by Tanner and Dietrich, began documenting the transmission systematically. They maintained a shared log, recording the date of each update, the future date mentioned in the transmission, and the 4-digit number. By January of 2012, they had collected 12 months of data. The future dates had all passed without incident. The numbers showed no obvious pattern. They ranged from the low 2000s to the mid 4000s, with no apparent sequence or repetition. Tanner and Dietrich decided to investigate the source. In February of 2012, they hiked to the coordinates provided in the transmission. The location was deep in the forest, approximately half a mile from the old Blewett mining camp at the base of a steep hillside. There was no visible structure, no equipment, and no sign that anyone had been there recently. Tanner brought a portable radio direction finder to try to locate the transmitter. The device indicated that the signal was coming from their immediate vicinity, but they could find nothing. They searched the area for over 2 hours. Nothing. Dietrich suggested the transmitter might be buried or hidden in the surrounding terrain. They returned with metal detectors in March and scanned the area thoroughly. They found old mining debris, nails, wire, fragments of rusted equipment, but no transmitter. Tanner also brought a spectrum analyzer to examine the signal's characteristics. The analysis showed that the transmission was analog, not digital, and used a modulation technique common in the 1950s and 60s. The signal strength suggested a low-power transmitter, probably no more than 10 watts, yet it was audible across a wide area. A radio engineer from Seattle named Dr. Raymond Teller reviewed Tanner's recordings and analysis. Teller confirmed that the signal was genuine and that the frequency and modulation were consistent with older broadcast technology. He also noted something unusual. The signal had almost no background noise. Most low-power transmissions pick up interference, static, hum, or ambient radio frequency noise. This one didn't. Teller said it was unusually clean for a signal of that type and power level. Teller suggested that the transmitter might be located underground or in a shielded enclosure, which could explain why it was so difficult to locate. He also proposed that the transmission might be automated, controlled by a simple timer or microcontroller programmed to update the message monthly. But Teller couldn't explain how such a device could operate continuously for years without maintenance or a power source. Batteries would have died. Solar panels would require exposure to sunlight, which didn't align with the underground theory. In June of 2012, a journalist from the Wenatchee World named Aaron Bledsoe wrote an article about the broadcast. The article included interviews with Tanner, Dietrich, and Teller, and it detailed the monthly updates and the unsuccessful search efforts. Bledsoe also contacted the Federal Communications Commission to ask if they were aware of the transmission. An FCC representative confirmed that the frequency was no longer licensed for civilian use and that any unlicensed transmission on that frequency was technically illegal. The representative said the FCC would investigate, but no follow-up was ever conducted. Bledsoe's article attracted attention from the broader ham radio community, and by late 2012, dozens of operators were monitoring the signal. Some traveled to the Blewett area to search for the transmitter. None found it. A few operators reported that the signal strength varied depending on atmospheric conditions, stronger on clear nights, weaker during storms, but the transmission itself never faltered. It continued month after month, always updating on the first. In 2013, a group of researchers from the University of Washington, led by a communications professor named Dr. Evelyn Strand, requested permission to conduct a formal study. Strand wanted to install monitoring equipment near Blewett to track the signal continuously and attempt a more precise triangulation. The request required coordination with the U.S. Forest Service, which managed the land. The Forest Service approved the request in principle, but required an environmental impact assessment. The assessment was completed in 2014 and concluded that the installation of monitoring equipment posed minimal environmental risk. However, funding for the project was never secured, and the study was abandoned. In 2015, an amateur cryptographer named Margaret Oakes analyzed the 4-digit numbers from the transmissions. She noticed that when the numbers were plotted over time, they formed a pattern, gradual increases and decreases with occasional jumps. Oakes speculated that the numbers might represent measurements of some kind: temperature, atmospheric pressure, or seismic activity. She compared the numbers to historical weather data and geological records for the Blewett area, but found no correlation. Another researcher, a mathematician named Harold Vasquez, suggested that the numbers might be encoded coordinates, a secondary location system overlaid on the primary coordinates. Vasquez attempted to decode the numbers using various mapping systems, including Military Grid Reference and Universal Transverse Mercator, but none produced meaningful results. The numbers remained unexplained. In 2018, the broadcast stopped updating. For the first time since 2011, the transmission on April 1st did not change. The date mentioned remained March 8, 2018, a date that had already passed. The coordinates were the same. The 4-digit number was 3241. Operators who had been following the broadcast for years were unsettled. Had the transmitter finally failed? Had someone turned it off? But on May 1, 2018, the broadcast resumed. The date updated to May 23rd. The coordinates remained unchanged. The number was 3309. The pattern continued. Whatever had caused the one-month pause was never explained. In 2020, during the early months of the pandemic, several operators reported that the broadcast had become more difficult to receive. The signal was weaker, more intermittent, as if the transmitter were failing. Tanner recorded the degradation and noted that the voice quality had also changed, slightly distorted with occasional dropouts. But the broadcast did not stop. It continued, updating monthly, though the dates mentioned were now only 2 to 3 weeks in the future rather than 4. In 2022, a team of radio enthusiasts organized a coordinated search effort. More than 20 people hiked to the Blewett area in September, equipped with direction-finding equipment, drones, and ground-penetrating radar. They scanned the forest, the hillside, and the ruins of the old mining camp. They found nothing. The signal was still audible on their radios, but the source remained invisible. One member of the team, a geologist named Susan Morales, noted something unusual. The hillside where the coordinates pointed was composed of volcanic basalt, a dense rock that could theoretically shield or muffle radio signals. Morales suggested that the transmitter might be inside a natural cavity or an old mining tunnel sealed by rockfall. The Blewett area had been extensively mined in the late 1800s, and many shafts and tunnels were never mapped. Morales said it was possible, even likely, that the transmitter was hidden somewhere underground, in a space that no one alive today knows exists. The broadcast continues. As of this writing, it updates on the first of every month. The woman's voice is still calm, still emotionless, still reading coordinates that point to a place no one can find. The dates mentioned are always in the future, 3 weeks, sometimes 4. The numbers change, but their meaning remains unknown. No one has found the transmitter. No one knows who programmed it, or when or why. And no one knows what will happen if the dates it mentions ever stop being in the future and start pointing to the past. Some populations grow in ways that cannot be explained. Medellin Falls sits in the northeastern corner of Washington state in Pend Oreille County, less than 5 miles from the Canadian border. The town was founded in 1910 as a company town for the Lehigh Portland Cement Company, which operated a limestone quarry and processing plant on the Pend Oreille River. At its peak in the 1950s, Medellin Falls had a population of nearly 600. But when the cement plant closed in 1982, most residents left. By the late 1980s, fewer than 200 people remained. The town became a shell of its former self: quiet streets, empty storefronts, houses with boarded windows. Yet it never disappeared entirely. A handful of families stayed, along with retirees and a few small business owners. Medellin Falls persisted, isolated and forgotten, on the edge of the Colville National Forest. The U.S. Census Bureau conducts a population count every 10 years, as mandated by the Constitution. In small remote communities like Medellin Falls, the process is straightforward. A field surveyor visits, counts residents, and files a report. The data is recorded, processed, and published. But in Medellin Falls, something went wrong, or more precisely, something went inexplicably right. The population kept growing, not by much, just one person every 10 years, and no one could say where they came from. The anomaly was first noticed by a data analyst at the Census Bureau's regional office in Seattle named Patricia Kowalski. In 2003, while reviewing historical census records for Pend Oreille County, Kowalski observed a pattern in the Medellin Falls data. The 1980 census recorded 183 residents. The 1990 census recorded 184. The 2000 census recorded 185. Each decade, the population increased by exactly 1. At first, Kowalski assumed the increases were due to normal demographic changes, births, arrivals, or relocations. But when she cross-referenced the census data with birth and death records, immigration logs, and property transfers, she found no documentation to support the increases. No births were recorded in Medellin Falls between 1980 and 2000. No new residents had registered with the county. No property sales had been logged, yet the population had grown. Kowalski raised the issue with her supervisor, a man named Gregory Tanner, who reviewed the data and agreed that it was unusual. Tanner contacted the field surveyors who had conducted the censuses in 1990 and 2000. The 1990 surveyor, a retiree named Harold Vasquez, said he remembered Medellin Falls clearly. He had spent 2 days in the town, going door to door, and had counted 184 people. Vasquez said the count had been straightforward, no complications, no irregularities. When Tanner asked if Vasquez had noticed anyone new or unusual, Vasquez said he hadn't. Everyone I talked to had been there for years, he said. The 2000 surveyor, a woman named Laura Dietrich, provided a similar account. She said the count had been routine. She'd documented 185 residents, all of whom appeared to be longtime inhabitants. Dietrich said she'd spoken with the town clerk and the postmaster, both of whom confirmed that the population had been stable for years. No one had moved in. No one had moved out. Yet her count showed one more person than the 1990 census. Tanner decided to investigate further. He requested detailed records for both surveys, including surveyor notes, questionnaires, and address lists. The records showed that the additional residents in 1990 and 2000 had been counted at occupied structures, houses, and apartments where people were living. But when Tanner tried to match the addresses to county property records, he found discrepancies. Some of the addresses didn't exist. Others corresponded to buildings that had been vacant for years. In 2009, as preparations began for the 2010 census, Tanner flagged Medellin Falls as a site requiring special attention. He assigned a senior surveyor, a man named Vincent Kowalski, no relation to Patricia, to conduct the count personally and to document any anomalies. Vincent was an experienced field surveyor with more than 20 years of service. He was methodical, thorough, and skeptical of irregularities. Tanner briefed him on the previous censuses and asked him to investigate whether the population increases were genuine or the result of clerical errors. Vincent arrived in Medellin Falls on April 12, 2010. He spent 5 days in the town conducting door-to-door surveys and cross-referencing his findings with local records. His notes, filed with the Census Bureau on April 19th, described the process as confusing and inconclusive. Vincent reported that he had counted 186 residents, one more than the 2000 census, but that the count did not align with the physical reality of the town. Vincent's notes mentioned discrepancies in occupied structures. He wrote that several houses he surveyed appeared empty when viewed from the outside, windows dark, no signs of habitation. But when he knocked it, someone answered. The residents were polite, cooperative, and provided the information required for the census. But Vincent said he found their presence unexpected and, in some cases, implausible. He noted one instance where he counted a man living in a house that the county had listed as condemned and scheduled for demolition. The man said he'd lived there for years. Vincent also documented what he called impossible head counts. He wrote that on April 14th he visited a duplex on River Street and spoke with a woman who identified herself as the sole occupant of the building. Later that day, while walking through town, Vincent saw two people entering the same duplex. When he returned to verify, the woman answered the door again and insisted she lived alone. Vincent said he could not reconcile the observation with the statement. On April 16th, Vincent requested assistance from the town clerk, a woman named Margaret Halstead, who had worked in Medellin Falls since 1978. Vincent asked Halstead to review his address list and confirm the occupancy of the structures he'd surveyed. Halstead reviewed the list and told Vincent that several of the addresses were incorrect. She said some of the buildings he'd listed had been empty for decades, and others had been demolished years earlier. When Vincent showed her photographs of the structures and the residents he'd spoken with, Halstead said she didn't recognize any of them. Vincent's final report, submitted on April 19th, concluded with a recommendation that the Medellin Falls census be reviewed and reconducted by a secondary team. He wrote that the data he'd collected was inconsistent with observable conditions and that he could not verify the accuracy of the count. He also noted that he had experienced difficulty maintaining consistent records and that his notes contained gaps and contradictions that he could not explain. Tanner reviewed Vincent's report and decided to send a second surveyor to Medellin Falls. The second surveyor, a woman named Rebecca Oakes arrived on May 3, 2010. She was instructed to recount the population and to verify Vincent's findings. Oakes spent 3 days in the town and filed her report on May 7th. She confirmed the count of 186 residents, but noted that her address list did not match Vincent's. Several of the houses Vincent had surveyed were not included in her count, and several houses she surveyed had not been documented by Vincent. Oakes also reported that residents she spoke with did not recall being surveyed by Vincent, even though Vincent's notes indicated he had spoken with them. Tanner escalated the case to the Census Bureau's Quality Assurance Division, which conducted an internal review. The review, completed in June of 2010, concluded that the Medellin Falls census data was unreliable and that the discrepancies could not be resolved through standard verification procedures. The review recommended that the 2010 count for Medellin Falls be suppressed and that the town's population be estimated based on the 2000 census. The recommendation was approved, and the 2010 count was never officially recorded. Tanner requested a meeting with the Medellin Falls Town Council to discuss the census issues. The meeting was held in July of 2010 and was attended by Tanner, Vincent, and 3 council members, including Margaret Halstead. Tanner explained the discrepancies and asked if the council was aware of any unreported residence or housing arrangements that might account for the census anomalies. The council members said they were not. Halstead reiterated that the town's population had been stable for years and that she personally knew most of the residents. She said she could not explain the additional person counted in each census. One council member, a man named Thomas Morales, mentioned that there had been rumors over the years about people living in abandoned structures on the outskirts of town, transients, squatters, or individuals avoiding official records. Morales said he'd heard these rumors since the 1980s, but had never seen evidence to support them. He suggested that the census surveyors might have encountered such individuals, though he acknowledged that this would not explain the precise, incremental population increases. The Census Bureau closed the case in August of 2010. No further investigation was conducted. The 2010 census for Medellin Falls was officially recorded as 185 residents, matching the 2000 count. The anomalies documented by Vincent and Oakes were archived as unresolved discrepancies and classified as internal records not subject to public release. In 2014, a journalist from the Spokesman Review named Aaron Bledsoe heard about the case through a source at the Census Bureau and requested access to the surveyor notes under the Freedom of Information Act. The request was partially fulfilled. Bledsoe received redacted copies of Vincent's and Oakes's reports with names and specific addresses removed. He wrote an article about the Medellin Falls census anomalies, which was published in October of 2014. The article attracted modest attention but prompted no official response from the Census Bureau. Bledsoe visited Medellin Falls in November of 2014 and spoke with several residents, including Halstead and Morales. Both confirmed the details of the 2010 census issues, but said they had no new information. Bledsoe also walked through the town, photographing the structures Vincent and Oakes had mentioned in their reports. He found that several of the addresses he'd identified from the redacted documents corresponded to buildings that were clearly abandoned. Roofs collapsed, windows broken, interiors exposed to the elements. Yet, according to the census notes, these structures had been occupied in 2010. The 2020 census was conducted remotely due to the pandemic, with residents submitting data online or by mail. The official count for Medellin Falls was 183 residents, 2 fewer than the 2000 count. The Census Bureau attributed the decrease to normal population decline in rural areas. No field surveyors visited the town, but in late 2020, a retired Census Bureau employee named Susan Halstead, Margaret's niece, contacted Bledsoe and told him something her aunt had mentioned before she died in 2018. Margaret had said that in the months after the 2010 census, she'd started noticing people in Medellin Falls she didn't recognize, walking on the streets, sitting on porches, standing in yards. She would see them once or twice, and then never again. Margaret said she'd asked around, but no one else seemed to notice them. Susan said her aunt had been troubled by it, but never reported it officially, because she thought people would think she was losing her mind. The census data remains unresolved. The pattern, one additional resident every 10 years with no documented explanation, stopped in 2020. Or perhaps it didn't. Perhaps the pandemic disrupted the count. Or perhaps whoever was being counted simply stopped answering the door. Some places remember the people who walked them even after they're gone. Dis Hotel was a small community in Okanogan County, Washington, established in the early 1900s along the Columbia River. The settlement served as a ferry crossing and supply point for ranchers and homesteaders in the surrounding hills. At its peak, Dis Hotel had a population of fewer than 100 people, a school, a general store, a post office, and a cluster of wooden houses. The town existed quietly until 1951, when the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation completed the Grand Coulee Dam's pumping plant and began filling Banks Lake, a massive reservoir designed to store water for irrigation. Dis Hotel, along with several other small communities, was evacuated and flooded. The buildings were left in place, and the town disappeared beneath more than 100 feet of water. For decades, Dis Hotel remained submerged and forgotten. But Banks Lake is a working reservoir, and its water levels fluctuate depending on irrigation demand and seasonal rainfall. During severe droughts, the water drops significantly, exposing sections of the lake bed that are normally underwater. In these rare moments, the ruins of Dis Hotel reemerge, foundations, roads, and the skeletal remains of structures that once housed families and school children. And in 2015, when one of the worst droughts in decades struck eastern Washington, Dis Hotel surfaced again. What park rangers found there defied explanation. The drought began in early spring. By late summer, Banks Lake's water level had dropped more than 60 feet below normal. On August 23, 2015, a Washington State Parks ranger named Gregory Tanner was conducting a routine shoreline inspection near the southern end of the lake when he noticed exposed ruins that he hadn't seen before. Tanner had worked at Banks Lake for 12 years and had seen the water drop during previous droughts, but the exposure this time was more extensive. He radioed his supervisor, a woman named Patricia Kowalski, and requested permission to document the site. Kowalski approved. Tanner hiked down to the exposed lake bed, which was dry and cracked, covered in a thin layer of silt and dried algae. He identified the ruins as part of Dis Hotel based on the location and the layout of the structures. Most of the buildings had collapsed into piles of rotted timber and rusted metal, but one structure remained partially intact, a single-room schoolhouse with 3 walls still standing and a section of the roof hanging at an angle. Tanner approached the schoolhouse and began photographing it for the Parks Department's historical records. As he circled the building, Tanner noticed something unusual, a set of footprints in the dried silt. The prints led from the edge of the lake bed across the open ground and directly into the schoolhouse through the doorway. Tanner followed them. Inside, the prints continued across the floor. To the center of the room, then stopped. There were no prints leading back out. Tanner examined the prints closely. They were barefoot impressions, adult-sized, approximately size 10 or 11, pressed clearly into the silt. The depth and definition suggested they had been made recently within the last few hours, while the silt was still slightly damp, but that didn't make sense. The lake bed had been exposed for weeks, and the silt had dried hard under the late summer sun. More troubling, Tanner had been the first person to visit the site since the water receded. The area was remote, accessible only by boat or a difficult overland hike, and no other visitors had been reported. Tanner took photographs of the prints and measured them. He also noted their direction and spacing, which suggested a normal walking gait. The person had walked calmly, deliberately, into the schoolhouse. And then, in the center of the room, they had simply stopped. Tanner searched the surrounding area for additional prints or signs of disturbance but found nothing. The only footprints were the ones leading into the schoolhouse. Tanner reported his findings to Kowalski, who visited the site the following day with another ranger, a man named Vincent Morales. Kowalski and Morales confirmed Tanner's observations. The prints were there, exactly as described. Kowalski also noted something Tanner had missed. The prints appeared to have been made on top of the dried silt, not pressed into it when it was wet. She could see cracks in the silt beneath the impressions, suggesting the surface had already hardened before the prints were made. This was unusual. Footprints in dried silt typically don't leave clear impressions. They crumble or leave only faint marks. These were deep and well-defined. Kowalski contacted the Okanogan County Sheriff's Office to report the discovery and request an investigation. A deputy, Officer Laura Dietrich, arrived on August 25th and inspected the site. Dietrich's report, filed later that day, noted the footprints and their location, but concluded that the prints had likely been made by a trespasser, possibly someone exploring the ruins illegally. Dietrich said the lack of return prints could be explained if the person had retraced their steps carefully or exited through a different route, though she acknowledged there was no evidence of an alternate exit. Dietrich also interviewed Tanner, Kowalski, and Morales, all of whom confirmed that no one had been authorized to visit the site and that the area was not easily accessible. Dietrich said she would monitor the site for further trespassing, but considered the matter closed unless additional evidence emerged. But the rangers were not satisfied. Kowalski asked the Parks Department to send a forensic specialist to examine the prints more closely. The request was approved, and on August 28th, a crime scene investigator from the Washington State Patrol, a man named Dr. Raymond Teller, visited the site. Teller brought casting materials and a portable ultraviolet light to analyze the prints in detail. Teller's findings were unsettling. He confirmed that the prints were recent, made within the previous 72 hours, based on the condition of the silt and the lack of erosion or weathering. He also confirmed that the silt had been dry when the prints were made, which he found highly unusual. Teller said that leaving clear impressions in dry silt required significant weight and pressure, more than a normal footstep would typically produce. He made casts of 3 of the prints and brought them back to the lab for further analysis. Teller's report, completed on September 4th, described the prints as anatomically consistent with human feet, but noted several anomalies. The prints showed no signs of arch support or toe spread, suggesting the person was either extremely flat-footed or not distributing weight in a typical manner. Teller also observed that the prints contained no foreign material, no dirt, vegetation, or debris, despite the fact that the surrounding lake bed was covered in dried algae and silt. The prints were clean, as if the feet had been washed immediately before walking. Teller recommended that the site be secured and monitored, but the Parks Department declined. Kowalski was told that the resources required to patrol the remote area were not justified, given the low likelihood of further incidents. The site remained open, and the water level in Banks Lake began to rise again in late September, as irrigation demand decreased and autumn rains arrived. By mid-October, the ruins of Dis Hotel were once again submerged. But before the water returned, Tanner visited the site one final time on September 19th. He wanted to photograph the schoolhouse before it disappeared. When he arrived, he found something that had not been there before, a second set of footprints. These prints were smaller, child-sized, and followed the same path as the first set, leading from the edge of the lakebed into the schoolhouse. Like the first set, they stopped in the center of the room. And like the first set, there were no prints leading back out. Tanner documented the new prints and immediately contacted Kowalski. She and Morales returned to the site on September 20th, but by then, the water level had begun to rise, and the lakebed was partially submerged. The schoolhouse was still accessible, but the area around it was flooded. The new prints were underwater and could not be examined further. Kowalski filed a report with the Parks Department, but no action was taken. A journalist from the Wenatchee World, a woman named Margaret Oakes, heard about the footprints through a source at the sheriff's office and wrote a feature article in October of 2015. Oakes interviewed Tanner, Kowalski, and Dietrich, and she reviewed the photographs and casts made by Teller. Her article included images of the prints and the schoolhouse, along with a brief history of Deautzel. The article attracted modest attention locally, but was not picked up by larger news outlets. Oakes also contacted a historian specializing in the Grand Coulee Dam project, a man named Harold Vasquez, to ask if there were any records of people refusing to leave Deautzel when it was evacuated. Vasquez said he'd reviewed the Bureau of Reclamation's relocation records and found no evidence of holdouts or resistors. Everyone had left voluntarily, and the town had been empty when the water began to rise in 1951. Vasquez said the only exception might have been transients or travelers who weren't officially counted, but there were no records to support that theory. In 2017, during another drought, the water level in Banks Lake dropped again, and Deautzel reemerged. Tanner, who was still working for the Parks Department, visited the site on July 15th. The schoolhouse was still standing, though more of the roof had collapsed. Tanner walked through the building, expecting to find the same dried silt floor. Instead, he found something else, a third set of footprints. These were adult-sized, like the first set, but they followed a different path. They entered the schoolhouse from the opposite side, walked to the center of the room, and stopped. No return prints. Tanner reported the discovery, but by this time, the Parks Department had grown weary of the reports. Kowalski, who had since retired, was no longer there to advocate for further investigation. Tanner's supervisor told him to document the prints and move on. No forensic analysis was conducted. The schoolhouse is underwater again now. Banks Lake's water levels have stabilized and the ruins of Deautzel lie beneath more than 100 feet of water. But the footprints remain in the photographs, in the casts stored at the Washington State Patrol Lab, and in the memories of the rangers who saw them. Barefoot, adult-sized, leading into a room that no one has occupied for more than 70 years, stopping in the center, never leaving. And every time the water drops, someone checks. Because if the prints are still there, or if there are new ones, then someone is still walking into that schoolhouse, and they're not walking out.